Hello, friend. I hope the day has been kind to you, and I am glad you found your way back. Let the pillow take the weight of your head. Your hands can go heavy now, wherever they happen to be resting, and your eyes can close whenever they want to. They do not need to wait for me. Tonight we are at sea. The year is 1715. The ship under us is small, 40 tons, perhaps 50 feet of deck from end to end. Aboard her tonight, 70 men. A merchant would work this same hull with 5 or 10, not the pirates of the films, the ordinary working night of ordinary working men. So here is the question I want to leave with you, the one we will answer by morning. How do you fall asleep when there is nothing underneath you but the sea? If quiet history like this is good company at bedtime, a like and a subscribe help these long nights find the people looking for them. There is no need to do a thing now. I would love to know where you are listening from tonight and what the hour is where you are. Someone with the window open and a fan going. Someone parked up for the night with the engine off. So turn your light down as low as it goes. Let the room go quiet around you and come with me now 300 years back, out onto warm, dark water, a long way from any land at all. Start with your feet. You're standing on planking, and the planking is warm. It has had the sun on it all day. The seams between the boards are filled with pitch, poured in hot, and by the middle of the afternoon that pitch had gone slightly soft, so that if you pressed a thumbnail into it you would leave a mark. It is firming up again now as the day goes out of it. That is the first thing to know about this place. It smells of tar. Everything here does. The deck is not large. From the very front of her to the very back is perhaps 50 feet, and you could walk it in a few dozen unhurried paces. She is a sloop, one mast with a long bowsprit reaching out over the water ahead, a great fore and aft mainsail on a boom that swings out over the rail, 2 or 3 triangular sails forward of the mast, and above the mainsail a square topsail for running before the wind. She is 40 tons burthen. That is not her weight. It is an old measure of what she could carry, and it means she's a small working boat by any standard, you know. And tonight there are 70 men aboard her. I want to sit with that for a moment, because it is the whole video. 70 men, on 40 tons, on 50 feet of deck. We know the figure because it is written down. On the 21st of November, 1715, the governor of Jamaica issued commissions to 2 sloops. One was the Eagle, 35 tons and 12 guns. She was commissioned for 80 men, and she actually carried 113. The other was the Bathsheba, 40 tons and 8 guns, commissioned for 80 and carrying 70. Those are real numbers, off a real piece of paper in this exact year. A merchant who owned a hull like this and used her for trade would work her with 5 to 10 hands. 5 men, perhaps 10. That is all it takes to sail her. Everything else aboard tonight is surplus, so the deck is crowded in the way a small kitchen is crowded at Christmas. People are always slightly in each other's way, and everybody has learned to move around it without thinking. Men step over each other. Men lean back against the same coil of rope. There is a way of walking on a vessel like this that involves never quite putting your full weight down until you know where the deck has gone. Look at what is actually up here with you. The mast, of course, coming up through the deck and going on up into the dark. You can put your hand flat on it. It is warm too, and slightly tacky with the same tar. The boat turned over and lashed down amidships. Not a lifeboat in the way you would think of one. A working boat for going ashore, for fetching water, for carrying men to a beach. Spare gear. Chocked and lashed so that nothing can move. On a vessel that leans this far, anything loose is a broken leg waiting to happen, so everything on deck is tied to something else. Hen coops, forward. There are chickens aboard. There is very often a goat. Ships of this period bought livestock at every port they touched, and kept them on deck, alive, until they were eaten. Woodes Rogers, an English captain writing of a single day in 1709, records shipping 7 live black cattle, some sheep, hogs and fowls, all in one go. So among the sounds tonight there will be hens shifting on a perch and hooves on planking. the hatch, square and small, leading down into the hold. We will go down there later. It is not a room. It is a crawling space, packed with casks and provisions and ballast, and there is not enough headroom in it for a man to stand. And right aft, a small cabin under a slightly raised deck. One room, the only door on the ship. Now, look outward. The sea from here is very close. That is the thing photographs never manage. On a vessel like this, the water is barely below the rail, and when she leans, it comes closer than that. You could put a hand in it without stretching. It is going past you at the pace of a brisk walk, and it is doing that all the time, all night, without stopping. The colour is going out of everything now. The sea was blue this afternoon, and it is going the colour of slate, then the colour of ink. The sky in the west still has some warmth in it, orange low down, going green, going grey. The wind is on the quarter, steady from the northeast. It has been like that for days. Out here it very often is. These are the trade winds, and they are one of the great reliable things in the world, and every man on this deck has built his entire working life on them. One more thing about her, and then we will let the light go. She is very likely built of Bermuda cedar. That matters more than it sounds. Cedar is hard and durable, and for its strength, remarkably light, so a hull built of it is stiff for the size of its timbers and quick through the water. It also lasts. A cedar hull could give 30 years of work where oak might give 10, and the worms that destroy other ships in a season find cedar unpleasant. Her shape under the water is sharp rather than round. A short full entrance at the bow, a long fine run aft, and a floor that rises steeply from the keel, so that in section she is more like a wedge than a bowl. She draws deeper at the stern than at the bow. All of that is why she is fast, and why she grips the water instead of sliding sideways when she leans over, which is a long way of saying she's a good boat. Small, well-made, and quick. Exactly the ordinary workhorse of these waters, which is also why nobody looking at her from a distance would think anything of her at all. She's not going anywhere in particular tonight. She has no cargo to deliver and no port she must make by Tuesday. She's simply at sea holding a course, the way a house holds its place on a hill. That is what makes tonight worth 2.5 hours of your time. Nothing is going to happen. The whole point of tonight is that nothing is going to happen. Let us say his name was Will. I should tell you plainly that Will is not a man from the archive. He is a composite, built only out of things we know were true of men on ships like this, and I will keep him honest all night. He is 27 years old, which was the ordinary age. He is out of Bristol, which is where 1/4 of them came from. He has been at sea since he was 14. He's sitting on the deck with his back against the boat, and he is watching the light go, and he is not thinking about anything much at all. In a little under 2 hours, every light in this ship will be put out, not dimmed, put out. That is a rule, and on a vessel like this one, on ships like this one, it was a rule crews eventually wrote down and swore to. And what happens after that is the story of tonight. Before the light goes entirely, though, it is worth understanding why there are 70 of them on a deck built for a handful. The answer is not what the films will have told you, and it is written down in accounts and wage books, and that is where we are going next. The short answer is that a war ended. In April of 1713, a series of treaties were signed at Utrecht, and the War of the Spanish Succession came to a close. For most people in Britain, that was very good news. For men who worked ships, it was the roof coming off. Here are the numbers, and they are worth hearing slowly. At the end of that war, the Royal Navy carried 49,860 men. 2 years later, it carried 13,475. Somewhere around 36,000 seamen were put ashore inside 24 months. About 73 of every 100 men in the service. They walked off the ships with whatever was owed them, and they looked for work, and at exactly the same moment the price of that work collapsed. A merchant seaman in 1708, when the war was on and men were scarce, could get 45 to 50 shillings a month. By 1713 he was getting about half of that, 22 and sixpence to 25 shillings, and it stayed there. It sat at around 24 shillings a month for the next 20 years without moving, though I will say now, as I will say again later, that the exact wage figure is one I could not stand up as firmly as I would like. So picture it from inside a man's life. He has spent a decade doing the hardest work available to an Englishman. The war ends. He is thanked and discharged, and the only berth he can find pays him half what it paid before, on a merchant ship where the food is weighed to the ounce, and the master can do very nearly as he pleases. That is the pool. That is where every man on this deck came from. We know that with unusual confidence because somebody has counted. Of 157 of these men whose earlier working lives are documented, 155 had been merchant sailors, navy men or privateers. 144 had merchant service specifically. Fewer than 1 in 20 began as a mutineer. These are not adventurers. These are tradesmen who changed employer, and they are not boys either. Take a sample of 117 of them, and the average age comes out at 27 and a little. The median is 27 exactly. The oldest is 50. Just under 60 in every 100 were 25 or older. 27. A working man in the middle of his working life. Old enough to have a wife somewhere. Old enough to be tired. Where were they from? About half were English, and a good quarter of those came out of Bristol, Liverpool and Plymouth, with another third out of Greater London. About a quarter were American, from the West Indies and the North American ports, Boston and Rhode Island and New York and Charleston, and something between a quarter and 3/10 were men of African descent. That last figure is an estimate made by historians who have spent their lives on it, and they will tell you honestly that it is hard to pin down, partly because of how the records were kept. But the deck you are standing on is not a white English deck. It is a mixed one, and it always was. Not all of them chose to be here either. Some were taken out of merchant ships and kept because they had a trade the company needed, a carpenter, a surgeon, a sailmaker. The records call them forced men, and we will meet one of them properly in the middle of the night, because what happened to him aboard is one of the warmest things in this whole story, and why a sloop rather than something grander? Because a sloop was fast, and because she drew very little water, so she could work close inshore and slip over shallow bars where a heavy naval ship could not follow. She could be run up on a beach and cleaned, and she was everywhere. A sloop on the horizon was the most ordinary sight in the Caribbean, and that ordinariness was worth more than any gun. Now, the last piece of why they are here. I will keep it brief, because it is a date and a reason and not a story I want to dwell in. On the night of the 30th to the 31st of July, 1715, only a few weeks or months before tonight, a hurricane came up the Florida coast and caught the combined Spanish treasure fleets as they were running for home. 11 ships were lost. A French vessel that had stayed further out to sea survived and reached Europe. The Spanish set up a salvage camp on the beach and began the long business of getting the silver back. That is all we need of it. It was a bad night, and it is not our night. What matters for us is what the news did in the taverns of the Caribbean. Word went round by ship and by newsprint that there was a beach in Florida with silver under the sand, and men left. The commander of one of the king's ships reported that he was losing 5 sailors a day, simply walking off to go wrecking. So by the autumn of 1715 there is a floating population of experienced seamen in these waters, with no war to fight, no wages worth having, and a rumour of money to the north. Some of them ended up on decks like this one, and I want to give you one of them by name, because he is real and he is beautifully ordinary. His name was Joseph Lorraine, and he was a barber surgeon, not physician, a man who cut hair and pulled teeth and set bones and did the small surgery of a small ship. He served aboard the Bathsheba, that same 40-ton sloop we met a moment ago. On the 21st of August, 1716, he stood in front of the Jamaica Council and gave a deposition, and in it he stated what he had been paid. He had received 3/4 of a share, 3/4 of one, not a whole one, which is what the deposition says. 3/4 of a share came to £34. Think what that is against a merchant wage of about 24 shillings a month. It is a great deal more than a seaman earned in a year, and a man who signed that deposition presumably went home, or went back to sea, or went somewhere, and lived on it. That is who is aboard tonight. Men who counted and compared, and made a decision. And I want to be careful here, because this is the point where a story like this usually turns loud. It is not going to. Almost nothing about the working life of these men was dramatic. They sailed. They pumped. They mended sails. They cooked in one kettle. They argued about food. They elected people and then complained about them. The overwhelming majority of the hours of their lives were spent doing exactly what a merchant crew did, in the same clothes, on the same ocean, eating the same salt beef. The difference was the arrangement. Who decided things? Who was owed what? And, tonight, who was awake? That is the part I want to show you. Now let us go forward, right up into the bow of this little ship, because there is one fire aboard and somebody's about to put it out. Go forward along the deck, ducking under the boom, and you come to a low structure right up in the bow, tucked under the small raised deck at the front. I should give you the right word for it, because it is not the one you expect. This is not the galley. The word galley, meaning a ship's kitchen, does not appear in print until about 1750, which is 35 years after tonight. In 1715 this is the cook room. Put your head in. It is dark, it is close, and it is the only place on the whole ship where fire is allowed to exist. The heart of it is a furnace built of brick. Inside the brick sits a great copper kettle, sometimes two, cylindrical, about 2/3 as tall as it is wide, with a lid that covers half the mouth and a tap near the bottom to draw water off. In front there is a hinged iron door, bolted to the brickwork. Underneath there is an ash pit, and underneath that layers of brick laid there for one reason only, to keep the fire from ever touching the wooden deck it stands on. That is the whole architecture of the thing. Fire in a brick box on a brick floor inside a wooden ship at sea. And because the fire lives in a brick box around a kettle, there is exactly one thing you can do with it. You can boil. That is not a small point, and it explains the entire diet of this world. There is no roasting to speak of, no baking, no frying worth the name. Everything the crew eats comes out of the same copper of boiling water. Each mess, each little group of 4 to 6 men who eat together, hands its provisions to the cook in a bag, and the bag goes into the common kettle with everybody else's, and what comes out is boiled. Now let me tell you about the cook, because he is one of the great unsung figures of the age of sail, and the truth about him is far more interesting than any invention. In the Navy he was a warrant officer, which sounds grand. In practice he was very often paid at the same rate as an able seaman, for a job which, as one summary of the period puts it, was specialised but was not regarded as a skilled craft. For a while in the early 1600s you could simply buy the post for £30, and then, from about the 1630s, the Navy did something rather remarkable. It began deliberately giving the cook's berth to disabled veterans. There is an Admiralty Order of 1676 which states that any such man who, by losing both arms or both legs, was wholly unable to help himself without another man's assistance, should have a servant allowed to him over and above the ship's complement. Read that again. Both arms, both legs, and a servant found for him so that he could keep working. We have names. In 1671, One-Eyed George Drake was cook of the St. David. In 1674, a man called John Gamble, who had lost both arms, was made a ship's cook. In 1704, aboard a third rate called the Content, the cook was stone blind. A blind man feeding a ship's company out of one kettle at sea. So when I say the cook, I want you to hold that. Very often he is a man the sea has already taken something from, and the ship has found a way to keep him. He has one perk, and it is a good one. The fat that rises off the boiling salt meat is skimmed and kept, and it is called the slush. It belonged to him. Over an 8-month voyage, the slush could be worth £20 to £25, sold ashore to tallow merchants, or sold to his own shipmates for waterproofing their clothes. That is more than an ordinary hand earned in a year, made out of the scum on top of a kettle. Before the fire goes out, look at what he's working with. We have an inventory from a merchant vessel called the Welcome, taken in 1676, and it is short enough to read out. A stewpan, a frying pan, a spit, a pot, tongs, a brass ladle and a flesh fork, 12 pewter spoons, and 12 wooden trenchers, 12 of each. That is the size of the crew in cutlery. A trencher is a flat wooden plate, sometimes with a shallow hollow cut in it, and men ate off them for centuries. Pewter for the spoons, because pewter can be cast and recast and does not rot. No forks worth mentioning. A knife you already own, because every man carried one for work anyway, and the men eat in messes, 4 to 6 men who take their food together every day for the length of the voyage. One of them is the mess's representative and goes to fetch what is due to them and divides it among the others. That little group of 4 to 6 is the most important social unit on the ship. They are the men who will notice if you are ill. Now, the thing we came forward to see. The cook lights this fire early each morning, and he puts it out after dinner. Dinner, in this century, is the middle of the day, so the fire goes out in the early afternoon and it stays out. Sir William Monson, whose naval tracts set out the standard duties of a ship's officers, put the rule down with its exceptions, and the exceptions are the reason I wanted to bring you in here. The cook, he wrote, is to put out the fire and suffer none to be kindled, or people to resort into the cook-room but in case of necessity, as namely, when the coxswain's gang comes wet aboard, or sick men have occasion to use the fire for their comfort. That is the whole of it. There are 2 reasons to light a fire on this ship after dinner. Somebody came aboard soaked, or somebody is ill and needs the warmth. I find that a genuinely lovely piece of rule-making. It is a fire rule, written by people terrified of fire, and even they built in a door for a wet man and a sick man. The same passage adds one more line, which tells you how tightly the room was held. No man but upon courtesy is admitted to have access into the cook's room. It was not a place you wandered into. From the later 1600s it was often sealed off from the rest of the forecastle, inside its own 6-sided compartment, partly to stop men pilfering the food. So stand here a second longer, in the last of the heat, while the iron door is closed and the ash settles. The kettle ticks as it cools. The brick holds its warmth for an hour or 2, the way an oven does. And the smell of boiled salt beef, which has been in the air since noon, begins very slowly to give way to the smell of tar. That is the ship going to sleep. It starts here, in the bow, with one man closing a door on a fire, which means the meal we're about to eat, the last one of the day, is a cold one, and it is worth staying for, because a cold supper on a moving deck turns out to be its own small piece of craft. The last meal of the day on a ship in 1715 is eaten in the late afternoon light, and none of it is warm. That is not a hardship. It is simply the shape of the day. The fire went out after dinner, and nobody is going to light it again for a plate of biscuit, so supper is what was left over and what keeps. Let me tell you what a seaman was owed, because we have the actual document, the victualling instructions of 1690. That is 25 years before tonight, which in the world of ship's provisions is no time at all. Every man, every day, was to have 1 pound of good, clean, sweet, sound, well-baked, and well-conditioned wheaten biscuit. That is the wording, and I love it, because you can hear a clerk who has been sent bad biscuit before. Every man, every day, 1 gallon of beer, then the meat laid out by the day of the week, on Sundays, Mondays, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 2 pounds of beef on 2 of those days, and on the other 2, 1 pound of bacon or salted pork with a pint of peas alongside it. On Wednesdays, Fridays and Saturdays, no meat. Instead, a portion of North Sea cod, or a piece of haberdine, or a pound of well-saved Poor John, which is dried salted fish, and with the fish 2 ounces of butter and 4 ounces of Suffolk cheese, and then, in the same document, the clause that matters for us, because we are in the tropics, for any ship going south of 39 degrees north, or bound for Guinea or the East or West Indies, the gallon of beer is replaced. In its place, half a wine pint of brandy. Beer does not survive a Caribbean hold. Brandy does. Now, the biscuit. A pound of it is 3 to 5 biscuits, and a period observer described them as being about the size of a plate. They are made from flour and water, worked into a stiff dough, baked in a hot oven for about half an hour, and then left to harden and dry. They are sold by the hundredweight, in sacks, 100 pounds at a time. They are also very hard. That is the point of them. A properly dry ship's biscuit will last months. You do not so much bite it as break it, and most men soaked theirs, in beer, in water, in the fat off the meat. I should say honestly that the famous stories about weevils, about knocking a biscuit on the table before you ate it, or eating in the dark so as not to see what was in it, are things everybody repeats and nobody can trace to anyone who was actually there. What is real is quieter and more convincing. There are ship's biscuits in museum collections today with the holes still in them, made by biscuit beetles. Now the beef, and here is where tonight gets interesting. Salt beef is not salted the way you would salt a joint. The meat is rubbed all over with white salt, then steeped in brine for 5 days, because blood spoils meat and the brine draws it out. Then it goes into casks in layers with more salt on top. The brine is mixed strong enough to float an egg, which works out at about 3.5 pounds of salt to the gallon, which means that by the time it reaches the kettle, it is inedible. You cannot boil it as it is. It has to be soaked first, in fresh water or sea water, for hours. So a ship carries a steep tub, and it carries men whose job is the tub. They were called shifters, and a period definition says they were those men employed by the cooks to shift or change the water in which the fish or flesh is put and laid for some time in order to fit it for the kettle. Their entire job is changing water on soaking meat, and because the fire is lit early in the morning, the meat that will go into it has to be soaking the night before. So somewhere forward of you, in the dark, all night, there is a wooden tub of salt beef quietly losing its salt into the water for a dinner tomorrow that nobody has thought about yet. That is one of my favourite facts about a ship at night. The whole vessel is asleep and the food is still working. There is one more thing on the menu out here, and it is the great luxury of these waters: turtle. William Dampier, who sailed this ocean and wrote it all down in 1697, gives us 4 kinds and tells you which to eat. The trunk turtle is bigger, but the flesh is rank and not wholesome. The loggerhead is likewise very rank and seldom eaten but in case of necessity. And then, in his own words, green turtle are the sweetest of all the kinds. He says they commonly weigh 200 or 300 pounds, and that their fat is yellow, and the lean white, and their flesh extraordinary sweet. They were carried alive. That is the thing to understand. A turtle stowed on her back on deck stays good for weeks, and one English captain of the period reckoned they were still fit to eat a month and a half later without being fed at all. Nathaniel Uring, another working captain writing in 1726, says 1 turtle was more than sufficient for all the company for a day, and warns, rather sadly, that after weeks in the hold they waste in their flesh and are not near so good as when they are first taken. Edward Barlow, a seaman we will get to know very well tonight, puts it plainly. One of them, he says, will serve 40 or 50 men, so the larder walks aboard and lives on deck and is used up slowly. Now the contrast. And this is the first of the things I want you to hold tonight without resolving. That 1690 document I read you weighs everything. 1 pound, 2 ounces, 4 ounces, a pint, half a wine pint. It is a document written by people who assume that if a thing is not weighed, somebody will steal it. And here is Alexander Exquemelin, who sailed with the buccaneers a generation earlier and wrote a book about it that was published in English in 1684. On how they fed themselves, he wrote this: "Here their allowance twice a day to everyone is as much as he can eat, without either weight or measure. Neither does the steward of the vessel give any greater proportion of flesh, or anything else, unto the captain than unto the meanest mariner. No scale, no weekly table, no short measure, and the captain eats the same as the poorest man on the ship." Both of those things are true, and there is a third, which is that the same arrangement could leave men on a bottle of water a day and 2 pounds of beef between 10 of them. Feast and famine out of the same barrel, depending entirely on the month. Do not resolve that tonight. Just hold it. Men who had been weighed to the ounce their whole working lives found themselves somewhere where nobody weighed anything, and it was wonderful, and it was fragile. Supper is finished. The trenches are wiped. The last of the light has gone out of the west, and the sea has gone black, and in a few minutes somebody is going to walk this deck putting flames out, one by one. Once he has, the whole shape of the night changes, and that is where we're going next. Here is the rule that orders everything. At 8 o'clock at night on this ship, every light goes out. Not lowered, not shaded, out. And I can read you the article, because somebody wrote it down and somebody else printed it. It comes from the company of a captain called Bartholomew Roberts, and it was drawn up a few years after tonight, around 1719 or 1720. It was printed in a book in 1724. I want to be straight with you that it is not a 1715 document. But the practice it records was already ordinary on every kind of vessel in this ocean, and this is simply the clearest surviving statement of it. Article 4. The lights and candles to be put out at 8 o'clock at night. If any of the crew, after that hour, still remained inclined for drinking, they were to do it on the open deck. That is the whole thing. 2 clauses, and the man who printed it added his own note straight afterwards. He said that Roberts believed it would give a check to their debauches, for he was a sober man himself, and that all his endeavours to put an end to it proved ineffectual, which is very human. He wrote the rule. The rule did not entirely work. He is not the first person that has happened to. But read the article again, because I do not think it is really about drinking at all. Open flames were forbidden aboard sailing ships, not discouraged, forbidden. A candle had to be inside a lantern. The only fire permitted in the whole vessel was in the cookroom hearth, and we have just watched a man close the iron door on that. So the article is a fire rule wearing a temperance rule's clothes, and you can see how seriously it was taken, because there is a second set of articles from a company under a man called John Phillips, sworn on the 29th of August, 1723, and one of them deals with exactly this. Article 6. That man that shall snap his arms or smoke tobacco in the hold without a cap to his pipe, or carry a candle lighted without a lanthorn, shall suffer the same punishment as in the former article. And the former article was Moses' law, which they define themselves as 40 stripes lacking 1, 39 lashes, for carrying a naked candle below decks. That is not cruelty for its own sake. That is a crew of men who have all seen or heard about what happens next. And here is why, in the words of somebody who was there. Edward Barlow was an ordinary seaman from Prestwich in Lancashire, who taught himself to write and kept a journal for more than 40 years, and we are going to lean on him all night. This is what he thought about at sea. Neither are ships and we poor seamen out of great danger of our lives in calms and fairest weather, he wrote. For the least fire may set a ship on fire, many ships having been burnt by some careless man in smoking a pipe of tobacco, and in carelessness of the cook, in not putting the fire well out at night, and of burning of a candle in a man's cabin, he falling asleep and forgetting to put it out. A candle in a man's cabin, he falling asleep and forgetting to put it out. That is the fear. Not storms, not enemies. A tired man and a candle. So at 8 o'clock they put them out. Somebody goes round. The lantern by the hatch. The candle in the cabin aft. Whatever small light has been burning while men ate and mended and talked. One by one, and it takes about a minute, and then the ship is dark. Stand here for that minute. It is the most important minute of the night, because what happens to your eyes when the last light goes is that, for about half a minute, you can see nothing at all, and then the sky comes up. Not gradually, all at once, as though somebody has taken a cloth off it. There is more starlight out here than you have ever seen in your life, because there is nothing between you and it and no other light anywhere at all. The sails go from black to pale grey. The rail comes back. The men come back as shapes. The ship is not dark. The ship was only dark while the candles were burning. I want you to stay in that a moment longer because it is the exact thing that happens in a bedroom when a lamp goes off, and you have felt it 100 times without noticing. There is a lantern at the stern on some nights, hung out so that another vessel can see you. Tonight, out here alone, there is no particular reason to show one, and a captain who wanted to be unseen would douse it anyway, so there is nothing. What comes back instead, slowly, over about 10 minutes, is the whole of the ship. The mainsail, a long pale shape leaning away from you, moving very slightly, breathing. The boom, a hard black line across the sky. The rigging, threads of it, catching whatever light there is. The deck under your feet grey now instead of black, and every seam in it visible as a darker line where the pitch sits. And the smell comes forward the way smells do when the light goes. Tar first and last. The pitch in the seams giving off the day's heat. The tarred rope, the oakum in the sides. A man's jacket which has tar on the shoulders, because everything on this ship eventually does. Here is the thing about that smell, and I will come back to it all night. Tar is what keeps the water out. So on a wooden ship, tar is the smell of being dry, which makes it the smell of being safe. These men worked inside it so completely that the word for tarred canvas, tarpaulin, became the word for the men themselves. Now hold two things at once, and do not try to settle them. Fire is the worst thing that can happen to this ship, and fire is the only comfort she has. The one warm meal of the day comes out of it, and the only two reasons you may relight it after dinner are that somebody is soaked, or somebody is sick. The thing they are most frightened of is the thing they most want. That is true of a great many houses in a great many centuries. It is simply more obvious out here, where the house floats. And now the second half of the article, which is the part I find so gentle. If any of the crew after that hour still remained inclined for drinking, they were to do it on the open deck. You're not told to stop. You're told to go outside. Up here, in the open air, where the wind is, where there is nothing to catch, and where every man aboard can see exactly what you're doing. Not below, in the dark, over the powder among the sleepers. It is a rule written by men who are realistic about other men. Nobody is going to stop a crew drinking, so take the drinking to the one place on the ship where it cannot burn anything down. The candles are out, and the ship, for the first time since morning, is quiet enough to hear itself, which is when you notice that it is not quiet at all, because on a night like this there was very often somebody playing. There is a single line in a book printed in 1724 which I think about more than almost anything else in this period. It is Article 11 of that same set of rules. The musicians to have rest on the Sabbath day, but the other 6 days and nights none without special favour. Let it settle for a second, because there is a whole world folded into it. First, there were musicians, not sometimes, not as an occasional novelty, enough of a fixed institution that a crew wrote a clause about them into their constitution. Second, they played at night. The article says so, 6 days and nights. Third, 6 days and nights is a working week. These men were working. Playing was their trade aboard, the way sail-making was the sailmakers. And fourth, the part I keep coming back to. A company of the roughest men afloat sat down and voted and gave the band Sunday off. Not because anyone made them. There was nobody to make them. They simply decided that a man who plays every night for a whole ship should get one day. We even have some of their names from the records of a later trial. Nicholas Brattler was a fiddler. He was taken out of a ship called the Cornwall Galley on the African coast, and kept because he could play. The testimony given about him said that he was only made use of as music, which he dared not refuse, and James White, who was described as decrepit and ill-shapen, and unfit for any purpose but music. He played upon the poop, which is the raised deck right at the stern, a man the sea had been unkind to, given a place at the back of the ship and a job. There is also an account from a merchant captain called William Snelgrave, who was held aboard one of these ships and wrote about it afterwards. He records the ordinary evening routine, and it is almost domestic. Supper was brought up about 8 o'clock in the evening, he wrote, and the music was ordered to play. Supper at 8, and then the music. Now let me clear something away gently, because it is the thing everybody expects, and it is not true. There were no sea shanties in 1715. I know, I was disappointed too. The word itself does not appear in print until 1867 in a sailor's memoir describing voyages of the 1860s. The great shanty tradition, the one everybody can hum, belongs to the merchant sailing ships of the 19th century, more than 100 years after tonight. What did exist in 1715 was simpler and, I think, rather better. There were hauling chants, not songs, cadences. A man crying out account so that 20 men pull at the same instant. A marine dictionary of the later 1700s describes work being regulated by a sort of song or howl, pronounced by one of their number, and the surviving examples are just that. Haul in, haul to, haul belay. There was instrumental music for work, a fife, a drum, or a fiddle at the capstan giving the rhythm. The Navy actually forbade singing while working and used the boatswain's pipe and instruments instead. And there was, in the evening, the ordinary music of ordinary English people taken to sea. Shore songs, ballads, psalms. The things a man learned in a village before he ever saw salt water. So here is the sound of the first watch tonight. A fiddle, somewhere forward, not loud. Nobody is dancing. It is the kind of playing a person does when they are half thinking about something else. The tune turning over and over, the odd stumble, a phrase repeated because it was good. Men talking. And this is one of the loveliest textures of the whole night, because you can hear them without being able to make out a word. Voices as pure sound, rising and falling, somebody's laugh. A long stretch where 2 men say nothing at all, and then one of them says one sentence, and the other one grunts. The forecastle, up in the bow, is where that happens. It is the ship's hearth in every sense except the fire. It is where men who are off watch collect, and where the talk is, and where a man with a story tells it. And over all of it, the ship, the water going past, the rigging, the soft, irregular knocking of a block against a mast. I want to stay with the voices for a moment, because they are one of the warmest sounds there is. You're lying, let us say, a little way aft of the forecastle, with your back against something solid. The men up forward are 8 or 10 feet away, and the wind is taking most of the words off over the side. So what reaches you is the shape of talk without any of its content. A long, low run of somebody explaining something, a short, flat answer, a pause, then 2 of them laughing at once and one of them going on laughing after the other has stopped. You do not need to know what it is about. You have never needed to know what it is about. It is the sound of other people being all right, nearby, in the dark, and it is quite possibly the oldest comfort our species has. The fiddler works his way round to the same phrase again. Somebody shifts a foot. A hen mutters in the coop and settles. And the songs, when there are songs, are not songs about the sea. That is the other thing people get wrong. They are the songs of the places these men came from, carried out here and sung badly and loved anyway. Ballads, church tunes, whatever your mother sang in a kitchen in Somerset when you were 4. Because the thing about a ship is that everybody on it is from somewhere else, and it is the evening when that starts to show. Edward Barlow, our Lancashire seaman, wrote about his first Christmas out of England. He was at Cadiz, which the English of the time called Cowes, and this is what he set down. "It was our Christmas day," he wrote, "and the first Christmas that ever I had out of England, but not the last by a great many. We had but small Christmas cheer, not having Christmas pie or roast beef, or plum pottage and such like." And then the line that gets me. "I remembering that the poorest people in all England would have a bit of something that was good on such a day." The poorest people in all England. He is not complaining about the food, he's thinking about home, and about the fact that even the poorest people there are having something nice tonight, and he is not. That is what the evening does to a man far from land, and that is why somebody plays, the candles are out, the fiddle is going. And out beyond the rail there is nothing at all for a very long way. You can drift here if you want to. Nothing in this chapter needs holding on to. If you go under now, the fiddle keeps playing, and the watch stays where it is, and I will still be here. Now the fiddle stops because a bell has gone, and a certain number of men are getting to their feet. Let us go with them, because the way a ship divides up its night is one of the neatest things human beings have ever built. Here is the machine that runs the night, and I think it is beautiful. A ship's day is cut into 7 watches, not 8, 7, and the fact that it is an odd number is the entire cleverness of the thing. Let me lay them out slowly. The first watch runs from 8 in the evening to midnight. The middle watch runs from midnight to 4 in the morning. The morning watch runs from 4 to 8. The forenoon watch from 8 until noon. The afternoon watch from noon until 4. And then, instead of one more 4-hour watch, 2 short ones. The first dog watch, 4 until 6. The last dog watch, 6 until 8 in the evening. 2 hours each. 5 watches of 4 hours and 2 of 2 hours. 20 hours plus 4. 24 hours in 7 pieces. Now why bother splitting the late afternoon in half like that? Because of the arithmetic, the crew is divided into 2 halves, called the larboard watch and the starboard watch. Larboard is the old word for what we now call port, the left-hand side. The 2 halves take turns, 4 hours on deck, 4 hours off, right round the clock. If there were an even number of watches in the day, the same half of the crew would stand the same watches every single day. The same men would get the middle watch, midnight to 4 every night, for the whole voyage, and the middle watch is the hard one. Everybody knows it is the hard one, but because there are 7, and 7 is odd, the rota turns over. Whoever had the middle watch tonight will not have it tomorrow night. It swaps, every single day, automatically, forever, with nobody having to decide anything. 2 little 2-hour watches inserted into the afternoon, purely so that the worst hours of the night get shared out fairly among men who will never think about it again. I find that genuinely moving. It is a piece of fairness built into the furniture, not written on a wall, not enforced by anyone, just arranged by somebody at some point so far back that nobody remembers, and then kept, because it worked. Now let us do the sums for our man Will, and I will keep them gentle. Say tonight his half of the crew has the first watch, 8 to midnight. Then they will also have the morning watch, 4 to 8, the afternoon watch, noon to 4, and the last dog watch, 6 to 8. That is 14 hours on deck out of 24. The other half tonight has the middle watch, the forenoon, and the first dog watch, 10 hours. Tomorrow it flips. He has 10. They have 14. So across any 2 days, each man stands 24 hours on deck out of 48. Half of his life, standing up, outdoors, for as long as the voyage lasts. That is the ordinary condition of a seaman in 1715, and if you have ever wondered why every account of these men mentions how weathered they looked, that is why. It is not the storms, it is the arithmetic. Now, the interesting part, and it is particular to tonight. Everything I have just described was designed for a ship with barely enough men to sail her. A merchant crew of 10, split into 2 watches of 5, working the hull with the smallest number of hands the owner could get away with. That is the world the two-watch system was built for, and it is brutal, because with 5 men on and 5 men off there is no slack at all. But look around this deck, there are 70 men aboard tonight. On a vessel a handful of them could sail, which means that all night, every night, this ship has more hands than she can possibly use. The watch can be lighter, a man can be spared. 3 watches instead of 2 are perfectly affordable, which would give a man 8 hours off instead of 4, and that is a luxury no merchant seaman aboard has ever had in his life. That surplus is one of the genuine, unglamorous attractions of a deck like this one, and I suspect it mattered more to these men than any of the things that get put in films. And it creates the other problem, of course. If 60 men have nothing to do, and the night is long, and there is drink aboard, you can see exactly why somebody eventually sat down and wrote an article about candles and 8 o'clock. The rules of a ship are almost always the shape of that ship's actual trouble. There is one more kind of watch worth knowing, and it belongs to the quieter nights. When a ship lies at anchor, she still keeps a watch, a smaller one, called the anchor watch. Its whole job is to make sure the anchor is holding. Everybody else sleeps, and 2 or 3 men stay up to check that the ship has not begun, very slowly and very quietly, to move. I find that a good image to keep. Even when there is nothing at all to do, somebody stays awake to confirm that nothing is happening. Now, the changeover itself, because it is a small ritual and it happens 6 or 7 times a day, there is no shouting, there does not need to be. The bell goes, and men who have been half sleeping for 4 hours sit up, and men who have been standing for 4 hours stop standing. They pass each other in a space too narrow for 2, and they do the thing people do in narrow spaces, which is turn slightly sideways without looking up. A few words are exchanged, and they are always the same words. What she is doing, what the wind has done in the last hour, whether anything has been seen. It is a handover, and it is as old as work. Then one set of men lies down where the other set was lying, in the warm patch they have left, and that is that. So the first watch is set. Some men are at their posts, most men are lying down, and the ship carries on doing what she was doing before, which is nothing in particular, very steadily, in the dark. Let me leave you with the 3 sentences I'm going to keep coming back to tonight, so that if you drift off and surface again, you know exactly where you are. The candles are out, the watch is set, the ship is being kept. That is all that is happening. That is all that is going to happen. And every one of those watches is measured by a single object, no bigger than your 2 hands held together, which somebody has to sit with all night long. So that is where we are going now. The ship's only clock is a glass full of sand. There is no other. No mechanical clock aboard worth the name, nothing that ticks, nothing with a face. Time on this vessel is a quantity of sand falling through a narrow neck, and when it has finished falling, somebody turns it over and it starts again. Half an hour each time. That is the whole of it, and every single thing about this night hangs off it. The glass is turned, and when it is turned, the bell is struck. 1 stroke at the end of the first half hour, 2 at the end of the second, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 8, and 8 bells is the end of the watch, and the whole thing begins again from 1. 8 bells, 4 hours, 8 turns of the glass. Now here is the piece of design I want you to notice, because it is exactly the same kind of thinking as the odd number of watches. The strokes are given in pairs, not 8 even strokes in a row. 2, then a gap. 2, then a gap. 2, then a gap. 2. 7 bells is 2, 2, 2, and then a single 1 on its own at the end. Why? Because you cannot count to 7 in the dark while half asleep, but you can count to 3 and a bit. You hear the pairs, and you hear whether there is an odd one on the end, and you know the hour without opening your eyes, without a light, without moving. The whole system is built for a man lying on a deck with his eyes shut, and the sound travels. The bell is struck at the glass and then repeated by the lookout at the ship's main bell. So it goes forward down the vessel, and rings out twice, once small and once large, half a beat apart. That is the metronome of tonight, every half hour for the whole of the dark. 2, 2, 2, 1. Now, who turns it? You will very often be told it was the ship's boy, and I want to be honest with you about how solid that is, because the honest version is nicer than the tidy one. The United States Naval History and Heritage Command puts it plainly. One of the ship's boys had the duty of watching the glass and turning it when the sand had run out, and when he turned the glass he struck the bell as a signal that he had performed this vital function. That is a real institution, and it is properly documented. But other sources give the job to the helmsman, or the ship's page, or the quartermaster, and no document from 1715 names a boy at a glass on a night like this one. So here is what is true. Somebody had to do it. On many ships it was a boy. On others it was whoever was nearest and could be trusted. And whoever it was, they sat there, in the dark, watching sand. Think about what that job actually is. For 4 hours you may not properly sleep, because if you sleep, the glass runs out and nobody turns it, and the ship loses the hour. You are the reason 70 other people know what time it is, and your entire contribution to the night, the thing that stands between this ship and being lost in time as well as in longitude, is that you stayed awake and turned a piece of glass over 8 times. I do not think anybody thanked him. Now, the glasses themselves, because they were not very good and everybody knew it. A sand glass is a delicate instrument pretending to be a simple one. Its accuracy depends on how uniform the sand is, on the exact bore of the neck, on how much the neck has worn, on the humidity sealed up inside the glass, on whether it can be stood perfectly upright, and on whether the thing holding it is being thrown about by the sea. On a ship, all of those go wrong at once, so the glasses ran fast or slow and drifted, and nobody could ever prove anything, which naturally means that men cheated. There is an old naval term for hurrying a watch along, flogging the glass, which is said to mean shaking it so the sand runs quicker and your 4 hours end sooner. I will say honestly that the phrase comes down to us through the kind of source that collects sailors' sayings, so hold it loosely. But the thing it describes is entirely plausible, because it was unprovable. If the glass ran fast, well, glasses do. Somebody, on some ship, on some very long middle watch, shook a glass and got 20 minutes of their life back. I would like to turn this one over gently before we leave it, because I think it is worth wondering about. Everybody you know can tell you the time whenever they want. It costs nothing. You look at a wrist or a phone or an oven. You have never once in your whole life not known what time it was. On this deck, the time is a physical object. It exists in one place. It has a custodian. If he falls asleep, the ship does not know what hour it is, and there is no way of finding out until the sun comes up. If the glass breaks, and glasses did break, that is a genuine problem, and a spare has to be got out of the stores. Time here is a possession. It can be dropped. And when it is over, when the 8th bell goes, it does not mean the hour is up in any abstract sense. It means 8 specific piles of sand have finished falling. That is all a watch is. 8 small journeys of sand from one bulb to another, and the ship has come 4 hours nearer morning. Let us come back to the deck. The bell has gone. The men whose watch it is are at their places. Everybody else has found somewhere to lie down, and you can hear the sand if you're close enough to it. That is the thing I would want most if I could go there. A little running whisper in a wooden box in the dark telling everyone how far through the night they have come. The candles are out, the watch is set, the ship is being kept. Now the first watch is properly underway and the ship is quiet. And all those men who are not on it have to lie down somewhere. On a vessel this size, that turns out to be the hardest question of the whole night, and it has a genuinely lovely answer, so that is where we go next. The bed these men sleep in came from the Caribbean, not from England, not from a shipyard. From the islands we are floating among tonight, and from the people who were living on them when the first European ships came over the horizon. The word is Hammock. It is Taino from the Arawakan languages of these islands, and the Taino wove theirs from cassava fibre, from bark, from agave, and later from cotton. The ones the Spanish saw were often 6 to 8 feet wide, hung between two poles by a cord which had its own name, Jico. Christopher Columbus wrote the word down on the 3rd of November 1492. That is about 3 weeks after he first made land. Great numbers of canoes came to the ships this day, he recorded, for the purpose of bartering their cotton and nets or hammocks on which they sleep. Nets on which they sleep. He did not have a word for it, so he described it. 100 years later, Sir Walter Raleigh, writing about Guiana in 1596, listed among the things people kept stores of beds which they call hammockas, and in 1597 the English Navy bought some. That is the moment it becomes ours. There is a warrant in 1597 authorizing payment for bolts of canvas to make, and here is the wording, hanging cabones or beds, and then the reason, for the better preservation of their health. I would like you to hold that sentence for a moment because it is a clerk in 1597 in a naval office, writing down why the government should spend money on beds for sailors, for the better preservation of their health. Somebody had noticed that men who slept badly got ill, and had gone to the trouble of arguing it in writing and had won. It did not happen quickly. It never does. In 1624, a fleet carrying 3,000 men received 300 hammocks, one for every 10. In 1625, they cost 2 shillings each. In 1628, a commander wrote home that there were no hammocks at all, and that the men lodged on the bare decks, and that their condition was miserable beyond relation. In 1629, the Navy managed 1 hammock for every 2 men on ships going overseas. By 1637, there were 2,236 hammocks in the whole of the Navy stores and ships in port. By 1647, the price had crept up to 2 shillings and 7 pence, and by about 1680, at last, canvas hammocks had generally replaced sleeping on the deck. 83 years from the first warrant to the ordinary thing. That is how long it took to give sailors a bed. Sit in that list for a second, because it is not just administration. Every one of those lines is a very large number of men sleeping on wood. 3,000 men and 300 hammocks. That means 2,700 men lay on the deck that voyage, in their clothes, wedged against whatever would stop them sliding, while 300 of them hung above and slept properly. And nobody thought that was scandalous. It was simply what there was. By the time of our night, more than a century later, the argument has been won so completely that nobody remembers it was ever an argument. A hammock is just what a sailor sleeps in, the way a bed is just what you sleep in. Almost every ordinary comfort you have was once somebody's proposal, written down, costed, and argued for by a clerk whose name has gone. Now let me show you the object itself, because it is made almost entirely by the man who sleeps in it. The body is thick canvas, of hemp or of cotton. At each end, the canvas is gathered into a bunch of small cords. The cords are called nettles, or nittles, and the gathered assembly at each end is a clew. There are usually 8 to 12 nettles in a clew, running from eyelets spaced along the end of the canvas down to a single eye or ring, so that the whole end of the bed comes to a point like the neck of a bag. A sailor made his own clews. He bought the rope yarn from the purser out of his wages, and he sat on deck in the afternoon and laid them up himself. If they wore out, he made new ones. If they broke in the night, and they did, he went down onto the deck. It hangs from nails. Not from purpose-made hooks, not at this date. Plain shipwright's nails, single or double, driven into the deck beams overhead, and the clew looped over them. And there is a small trick in it that I love. You do not loop the clew over the nail nearest you. You loop it over the one on the far side of the beam, so that the pull is against the beam and the loop cannot slip off in a seaway. It hangs fore and aft, running the length of the ship parallel to the keel, about 4 feet above the deck, which is high enough to walk under and low enough to get into. And that direction is the whole point, because if the hammock runs the length of the ship, then when the ship rolls from side to side, the hammock swings from side to side too. Think about what that means. A hammock is a pendulum hung from 2 points. When the vessel leans, the 2 points holding your bed lean with her, but the loaded bag underneath them does not. It hangs where gravity tells it to hang. The ship rotates around you and you stay level. The ship rolls, The man does not. That is not a small comfort. That is the difference between sleep and no sleep. Before hammocks, men slept on the deck or in fixed wooden berths, and in a seaway they were thrown out of them. Sailors were injured falling from berths, and sailors were killed rolling about a deck when a ship lurched. The hammock did not just make sleeping more pleasant, it made it survivable. There is one more thing it does, which is why it beat every alternative. The sides come up around you. A loaded hammock is not flat. It is a curve, and the canvas rises on both sides and wraps in so that a sleeping man is held rather than balanced. He can let go completely. Even in a swell, he's not doing any work. A captain of the period named Nathaniel Boteler put the case for them in one flat sentence. The lodging of the common men in hammocks, he wrote, is far more wholesome and preferable. Wholesome. That is the word a 17th century officer reached for. Not comfortable. Wholesome, meaning it keeps a man well. That is your bed for tonight. Canvas, 12 cords, 2 nails, and a very long argument about the health of seamen. So that is the bed. The next question is how much of it a man actually got, and the honest answer is stranger and kinder than the number everybody quotes. There is a number that everybody quotes about this, and I want to handle it carefully because the truth is better than the number. The number is 14 inches. 14 inches is the width a man was allowed for his hammock in the Royal Navy of this era. Put your hands up and hold them about that far apart. That is your bedroom. It gets quoted everywhere, and it always comes with a little shiver, and I understand why. But I've gone looking for where it comes from, and the honest answer is worth telling you. The 14 inches is a scholar's figure. It comes from a modern historian of naval fitting out, summarizing practice across 2 centuries. It is almost certainly right as a description of what happened, but there is no surviving regulation from 1715 that fixes it, and the earliest firm document anybody has found putting the number down in writing is from 1797, which is 82 years after tonight. And the version you will hear most often, that it was 14 inches in wartime and 28 inches in peacetime, appears to be a modern muddle. I went and looked at the actual naval regulations of 1731, which is the closest full rulebook to our night, and it does not contain a berthing measurement of any kind. Not one. There is no hammock spacing clause in it at all. So where does 28 come from? 2 places, and this is where it gets good. The first is that petty officers, the small ranks above an ordinary hand, were allowed roughly double. That is a hierarchy, not a rule about war and peace. The second is the one I actually love. 28 inches was what an ordinary man got anyway most of the time because of the watch system. Think it through with me. The hammocks are numbered, and the numbers alternate. Odd numbers belong to one watch. Even numbers belong to the other. So along a row of slung hammocks it goes starboard, larboard, all the way down. Which means that when half the crew is on deck, every other hammock in that row is empty. Your neighbours are not there. They are outside in the wind holding the ship. Their beds hang slack on either side of you, and you have their space as well as your own. 14 inches on paper, 28 in the dark, and then 4 hours later they come back and you go out and they get yours. I think that is one of the quietest, kindest facts in the whole of maritime history, and nobody ever mentions it, because the shocking number makes a better line. The truth is that these men slept in shifts in each other's space, all night, every night for years, and it worked because half of them were always awake. They were sharing a bed. They were just never in it at the same time. The numbering did other work too, and it's all quietly practical. Alternating the watches along the row stopped the ship from listing at night under uneven weight, because the sleeping men were spread evenly rather than bunched. It meant that if the ship was called to arms in the dark, half her people were already standing, and every man's number matched a number on the beam above him and a number on the watch list, so that in a space with no light and no signposts he could find his own bed by counting. Your number was your place in the night. It told you where to sleep and when to wake. I should say, as I did with the 14 inches, that the earliest firm document setting all this out comes from the 1790s. It is clearly an old practice by then, and it must have grown up long before anybody troubled to write it down. But I would rather tell you that than pretend to a certainty nobody has. There is one more piece of the geometry, and it explains how the rows fit at all. They were slung interlocked, head to foot, with about 18 inches of overlap, like fingers laced together. One man's feet lay level with another man's shoulders, and the widest part of one body sat against the narrowest part of the next. Somebody worked that out. Somebody stood in a dark space with a piece of chalk and solved a packing problem, so that more men could lie down. Now what you actually lie on, because the hammock is only the sling. The bedding was a separate thing, and on the evidence it belonged to the man, not to the ship. We know its exact specification for almost precisely our year. The Admiralty's general printed instructions of about 1715 say, "A bed was to be 5 feet 8 inches long and 2 feet 2 inches broad, stuffed with 11 pounds of flock and valued at 11 shillings the set." 11 pounds of flock. Flock is the waste of the wool and cloth trades, the short fibres and clippings, the sweepings of the finishing floor. It is what you stuff a mattress with when you cannot afford feathers, and almost nobody could afford feathers. 5 feet 8 by 2 feet 2, 11 pounds, 11 shillings. That is the mattress, and it is bought out of your wages, stopped from your pay by the purser, and entered in the muster book against your name. Sheets and a pillow were counted a luxury. Most men did not have them. What they had was the flock bed, a blanket, and the clothes they were already wearing. And that is very nearly the whole of a seaman's property. Let me give you a real one, because there is a probate record. His name was John Chapman, and he was chief mate of a ship called the Daniel and Henry. He died on the 9th of October, 1700. When his belongings were listed, he owned 2 sea chests marked with his initials, J and C, cut or painted into the wood. They were valued at 3 or 4 shillings each, 2 boxes, 6 boards apiece, nailed at the corners, no craft in them at all. His initials on the lid so that in a dark space full of identical boxes he could find his own. A young man of the 1710s named John Cremer bought his whole kit for a 2-year voyage, shirts, stockings, handkerchiefs and a chest for 40 shillings, £2, and most seamen, when everything they had in the world was added up, came to £10 or less. A chest, a blanket, a knife, 11 pounds of flock, and a chest, when there was no room to sling a hammock, became a bed. Men slept on them, on top of the lid, and men slept on the deck beside them, and this is documented over and over. Where there is not room to hang, you lie on your box. So this is the strange, small human architecture of a night at sea. A numbered nail on a beam, 14 inches of paper and 28 of practice, a bag of wool clippings weighed to the pound by a government office, 2 boxes with a dead man's initials on them. Nobody in this story is comfortable in the way you're comfortable tonight, but they are not being neglected either. Somebody sat in an office and specified the length of the mattress, the width of the mattress, and the exact weight of stuffing that should go into it. 11 pounds. Not 10, not 12. Care, in this world, looks like a number in a specification. The candles are out, the watch is set, the ship is being kept, and all of that is laid down inside a box of oak and tar. So before we let anybody sleep, we should look properly at the thing standing between them and the ocean. This is the part I've been wanting to get to all night. Every other place this channel has taken you had walls. A cottage has walls, an inn has walls and a courtyard, and a gate that shuts. A longhouse has turf on the roof, and a byre at one end and cattle breathing through the partition. Here, the wall is oak, and it is not thick. Let me build it for you, from the inside out, because it is one of the most extraordinary pieces of ordinary craft in human history. First the frames, the ribs, curved timbers standing up from the keel, then the planking, laid along the outside of them and fastened with tree nails, which are wooden pegs driven through and swollen tight. Hull planks of the era ran perhaps 10 to 12 inches wide, but planks laid edge to edge do not make a watertight thing. They cannot. Wood moves. So between every pair of planks there is a beveled gap, a quarter of an inch or a little more at the surface, and that gap has to be filled. What fills it is oakum. Oakum is old rope. That is the whole beautiful economy of it. Worn-out tarred cordage, unpicked by hand, strand by strand, back into loose fibre. The old caulking is first dragged out of the seam with a reefing hook. Then the new fibre is tucked in a series of small loops, and driven into a hard tight wad between the plank faces with irons shaped like a fishtail, hit with a mallet. And the mallet is where I want to stop. A caulking mallet is deliberately made to ring, and it sings when it strikes. Not for cheerfulness, because the cocker listens to the pitch. As the oakum compacts, the note changes, and a man who has done it for 20 years can hear when the seam is right and stop. He is tuning the ship. That is genuinely what is happening. 2 men, an iron, a mallet, a fast double strike going along a seam, and the note rising as it hardens. You would have heard a ship being built before you saw it. Then the seams are sealed. On the deck, hot pitch is poured in, and that is called paying. And the bottom gets stuffs. That is the actual word. White stuff was whale oil, rosin and brimstone painted on the hull under a sacrificial layer of thin wooden sheathing. Black stuff was tar and pitch. Brown stuff was black stuff with brimstone added. The sheathing planks were there to be eaten, so that something else could be eaten instead of the ship. Because of the worm. The shipworm is not a worm at all, it's a small mollusk, and it bores tunnels up to 2 feet long into submerged timber. Pine can be riddled inside 16 weeks and oak inside about 32. Nathaniel Uring, who we have already met, describes meeting 2 captains who had each lost a ship, and the second, he says, had left his in Jamaica, her bottom being eaten up with the worms and rendered unserviceable. That is a ship destroyed from underneath by something you cannot see, in a season. So every few months this vessel is run up on a beach and laid over on her side, using her own mast as a lever with tackles hauling the masthead down until the keel comes clear of the water. The bottom is scraped and burned clean with torches of reeds and pine brush, and greased and paid and put back in the water. Then she's turned round and the other side is done. It takes 2 to 4 weeks, or 9 or 10 days if somebody's in a hurry. That is what it costs to keep a wooden thing floating. Now, the thickness. I want to be honest, because it matters. Nobody can give you a figure for the bottom planking of a 40-ton sloop in 1715. The standards of the period covered warships of 20 guns and upward, and a sloop this size was beneath the paperwork. What we know is that a frigate's ordinary bottom plank was about 4 inches of oak, and that a small sloop, being a far lighter vessel, would be thinner than that. So I will not give you a number I cannot stand behind. Here is what I can say, and it is true at any thickness in that range. A man lying in the bottom of this vessel has less than the width of his own hand between his ear and the Atlantic Ocean. Hold your hand up, look at it. That is the wall. On the other side of it, the water is 3/4 of a mile deep. It is moving past at walking pace, and it does not stop. And it has been doing that since before the first hammock was hung, and it will still be doing it tomorrow night. And the wood holds. That is the fact I want to leave you with, because it is the whole comfort of this video. It holds. All night, every night, for years, with almost nothing between, because somebody unpicked old rope into fibre, and somebody rolled it, and somebody drove it into a seam and listened to a mallet until the note was right. Now, so that we are honest, let me tell you what it is like when it does not hold, and then we will put it away. Nathaniel Uring, in January in a small sloop with only a half-deck forward and no bulkhead in her. This is his own account. It was very cold, he says, and he had but cold lodging. He put his bed as close to the side of the fire hearth as he could get it to keep himself as warm as possible. A blanket and a piece of an old sail were all his covering, apart from the clothes he stood up in, which he says were few enough, and then the deck above him, which wanted caulking. So the snow and rain which fell came through the seams, and he was continually wet. And this is the detail I cannot forget. When he found the wet coming through to his skin, by continually dropping in one place, he moved his covering and received it in another part, until at last his covering was wet all over, and a little puddle of water settled under the lower part of his back. He paid for it. That part of his back, he wrote, was so benumbed that he had no right feeling in it for several years. That is one bad seam over one sleeping man on one January night. But tonight, on this deck, the seams are sound. The tar is holding. The mallet did its work in some yard months ago, and the note was right. The water is going past a hand's width away, and it is staying exactly where it is. The candles are out, the watch is set, the ship is being kept, and the water is staying outside, and the plank is holding. So we can go back up on deck now, because on a vessel this crowded, that is where most of these men are going to sleep. Let us do the arithmetic, and let the arithmetic tell us the answer. 70 men, 40 tons, 50 feet of deck, below the hold. And I want to be clear about what a hold is on a boat this size, because the word suggests a room, and it is not one. It is the space between the ceiling planking and the deck above, and on a 40-ton sloop that is a crawling space. You go into it on your hands and knees. It is full of water casks, which are the largest and heaviest things aboard, and provisions, and the ballast, which is stone or shingle laid over the keel to keep her upright. There is no headroom. There is no floor as such. There is no place to lie flat that is not on top of something. Aft, the cabin. One small room under the slightly raised deck at the stern, and on a vessel like this it might hold 3 or 4 men lying down if they were friendly. And here is the thing about that cabin, which is one of the most quietly funny facts of the period. On ships of this kind, the crew voted the great cabin to the captain. It was his. And then, as the man who wrote it all down in 1724 recorded, every man, as the humour takes him, will use the plate and china, intrude into his apartment, swear at him, and seize a part of his victuals and drink if they like it, without his offering to find fault or contest it. They gave him the only private room on the ship, and then walked into it whenever they felt like it. The same writer summed the whole arrangement up in one line. They only permit him to be captain, he wrote, on condition that they may be captain over him. More than that, on ships of this sort the partitions often came out altogether. There is a phrase for it in the records. They knocked down the cabins and made the ship flush fore and aft. Out came the joinery, out came the walls, and what was left was one open vessel with more room for men and more room for guns. So, 70 men, a crawling space below, one small cabin aft that is not really private. Where does everybody sleep? On the deck, in the open air, under the sky. Now I have to be straight with you here, because this is exactly the sort of thing that gets stated as fact by people who have not checked. There is no document from this period which says, in so many words, that these men slept on deck as a general practice. We know it because of the numbers. We know it because a 40-ton hull cannot hold 70 men below. We know it because they took the cabins out. We know it because the article about candles tells drinkers to go up onto the open deck after 8, which tells you the open deck at night was somewhere men already were. And we know that when a ship ran short of the nails to sling hammocks from, 2/3 of her people simply lay down on the planking, because a captain wrote exactly that in his log. That last one is from a voyage of 1767, so it is later than our night, and I offer it only as proof of what happens when there is nothing to hang a bed from. So here is the honest sentence, and I think it is more moving than the confident one. The reason we know they slept on deck is that there was nowhere else, and in this ocean, in this month, that is not a hardship at all. I want to be careful about that too, because there is a version of this story where everyone shivers all night, and it is not true. The sea here holds between 27 and 29 degrees, all year round, and it barely varies. The air sitting on top of it does not cool much after dark, because the ocean is an enormous store of heat, and the night is not long enough to make a dent in it. A night at sea, off Florida, in high summer, is somewhere around 25 or 26 degrees at 3 in the morning. That is warmer than a summer night in England. Nobody's freezing out here. I'm not going to tell you they were. But men were cold, and here is why, and it is a completely different mechanism. Wet clothing makes a body lose heat about 5 times faster than dry clothing. Water carries heat away from skin about 25 times faster than air does. And wool, which is the miracle fibre of this world and holds warmth beautifully when it is damp, stops working when it is truly soaked. A saturated wool blanket tested properly insulates worse than nothing at all. So a man who has stood 4 hours in spray in a steady trade wind is not cold because the air is cold. He is cold because he is wet, and the wind is taking the heat off him faster than his body can make it. The thermometer would say 78 degrees. It would mean nothing to him whatsoever. And Edward Barlow, who was there, says exactly this. In the tropics, he wrote, the extreme hot weather changeth to very cold all upon a sudden. And our Europeans, many of them being careless of themselves, catch colds. Careless of themselves, meaning they did not change, meaning they were tired and they lay down as they were. So picture the deck now, properly, because this is the image at the centre of tonight. Let us find Will again, and remember he is my composite and not a man from the archive. He has a place. Everyone has a place. And it is always the same place, because that is how people are. His is between the mainmast and the boat, on the side where the deck stays driest. He has a piece of old sail. Half the ship has a piece of old sail. Canvas that is too worn to be trusted aloft ends its life as bedding, as bags, as covers, as everything. He lies down with his back against the boat's turned hull, because you always want something solid behind you on a deck that moves. 10 feet away, 2 men lying close together, and there is no more to it than the plain fact that 2 bodies are warmer than one and always have been. Forward, somebody on a coil of rope, which is a genuinely good bed if the coil is big enough because it is springy and it holds a shape. 1 man on his chest, 1 man under the boom, and above all of them the sky, which out here is not really dark at all. Now hold the 2 things that are true about this deck at once. It is the most crowded place any of these men have ever slept. 70 bodies on 50 feet. You cannot move without touching somebody. You cannot turn over without the man beside you knowing you turned over. And it is the most solitary, because each of them is lying in the open, in the dark, with the sky over him, and the sound of the water going past, and no walls, and no roof, and nothing at all around him but the sea for a very long way, crowded and alone at the same time, all night, which is, if you think about it, quite a lot like a city. Listen to what he can hear from down there. The water first, always, not a crash. A long continuous pouring hiss along the side, rising a little when she leans, easing when she comes back. The rigging above, which is not silent either. A rope moving very slightly against a block. A halyard tapping. The mainsail giving one soft heavy sound when the wind eases and takes it again. The hull under his shoulder, working, which is the word for a wooden ship flexing as she goes. Not a groan. 100 small settlings, each in its own time. A hen shifting on a perch, the goat's hooves twice and then nothing, and somebody's feet up near the bow, the watch, walking. That is the sound that puts a man to sleep, and I mean that seriously. He is not asleep despite the watch walking about. He is asleep because of it. Nobody is undressing. Nobody has changed. They are lying down in the clothes they worked in, which brings us to the last thing standing between that wind and their skin, and it happens to be a set of clothes we can price to the penny. I can tell you what these men were wearing item by item with the cost of each, because in 1706 the Admiralty signed a contract for it and somebody kept the paperwork. This is 9 years before tonight. It is as close as clothing history ever gets. A shrunk grey kersey jacket, lined with red cotton with 15 brass buttons, 10 shillings and 6pence. A waistcoat of Welsh red, plain and unlined, with 18 brass buttons, 5 shillings and 6pence. Red kersey breeches lined with linen with 3 leather pockets and 13 white tin buttons, 5 shillings and 6pence. Striped shag breeches lined with linen, 10 shillings and sixpence, shirts of blue and white checkered linen. 3 shillings and threepence, leather caps faced with red cotton and lined with black linen. 1 shilling and twopence, grey woolen stockings. 1 shilling and ninepence the pair, grey woolen gloves or mittens. 6pence, double-soled shoes, round-toed. 4 shillings the pair, and brass buckles with iron tongues. 3pence. Now 2 things jump out of that list, and the first one will surprise you. He is not in blue. The sailor of 1715 is dressed in grey and red. A grey jacket lined with red, a red waistcoat, red breeches, grey stockings, a leather cap faced with red. The only blue on him is the shirt, and the shirt is blue and white checkered, which is the one garment that really is his badge and stayed his badge for 100 years afterwards. The blue sailor is a much later invention. Ordinary seamen had no uniform at all until 1857. The second thing is the price. Add up a full rig: jacket, waistcoat, breeches, a couple of shirts, stockings, shoes, a cap. You're somewhere around £1 and 17 shillings, and a seaman's wage was in the region of 24 shillings a month, though I will say plainly that I could not stand that figure up as firmly as I would like, so hold it loosely. Even so, getting dressed costs you about 6 weeks of work, which is exactly why he is sleeping in it. Now let me tell you why the clothes are the shape they are, because every single choice in that list is doing a job. Wool everywhere it touches the body. Kersey, which is a coarse-ribbed woolen twill, full to make it dense. Shag, which is thick wool with a long nap on one side, warmer, and notice that the shag breeches cost exactly twice the kersey ones. Wool for the stockings, wool for the mittens. Why wool? Because wool absorbs about 30% of its own weight in water and still holds air inside the crimped fibre. And here is the part that sounds like a fairy tale and is simply chemistry. When wool takes up water, it gives off heat. Not much, but real, measurable heat, at exactly the moment you've got wet and need it. A damp wool jacket is warming you slightly, from the inside because it is getting wet. Linen where the cloth has to breathe and dry fast. The shirt. The drawers. Ticking, which is that dense striped linen used for mattress covers, made up into hot weather waistcoats and breeches, and tar on the outside, where the water has to be shed rather than held. That is where the word comes from. Tarpaulin is tar plus palling, an old word for a covering, and it first turns up around 1605. Sailors tarred their canvas trousers and their jackets and their hats to keep the wet out, and within a century the word for the cloth had become the word for the man. Jack Tare. I should add one small correction, because it is the kind of thing this channel likes to get right. The neat oilskin suit you're picturing, the yellow one, does not exist yet. Purpose-made waterproof hats are barely evidence before the 1750s. What is real in 1715 is tar smeared on ordinary clothes, and grease, and an old felt hat with tar worked into the brim, and on his head very often a Monmouth cap. That one is worth a moment, because it is a beautiful bit of making. It is knitted from coarse wool, in the round, from the lower edge upwards, into a rounded crown. And then it is felted. It is worked and shrunk on purpose, until the stitches close up into a dense mat, and the whole thing goes weatherproof. Soldiers wore them, and labourers, and sailors, for 300 years. There was even a law once, in 1571, fining you 3 shillings and 4pence a day for not wearing a woolen cap, which tells you something about the wool trade and its friends in Parliament. The Navy was still buying Monmouth caps at 2 shillings, and 6pence apiece in 1690. Hardly any survive. That is the way with the things everybody had. Nobody keeps the ordinary thing. The garments are short, and that is deliberate. The jacket ends at the hip. The trousers end between mid-calf and the ankle. Less cloth to soak, less weight of water to carry, and less to catch on anything when you're up a mast in the dark. And bare feet very often on deck. That is not poverty. That is sense. A wet leather shoe on a wet-canted deck is a slide, and a slide is a fall, and a fall on a ship is a serious thing. Bearskin grips. Now how do you dry any of it? You do not. That is the plain answer. There is no stove. The fire is out. Below decks the air is saturated, the deckhead drips, and there is nothing to dry into. What you do is wait for a calm morning, and then you hang the entire ship with your clothes. Woodes Rogers, coming aboard his consort ship after a hard passage round Cape Horn, wrote down what he found, and it is one of my favourite pictures of the age of sail. We found them, he says, in a very orderly pickle, with all their clothes drying, the ship and rigging covered with them from the deck to the main top. The whole vessel, rigging and all, hung with wet washing, a ship dressed like a Monday morning. Until that morning comes, you wear them wet. And Edward Barlow, describing what that actually meant for sleep, gives it to us in one short phrase at the end of a long sentence. They were called up at all hours, he says, and went up half awake and half asleep with one shoe on and the other off, not having time to put it on. Always sleeping in our clothes for readiness. That is the line. Always sleeping in our clothes for readiness. It was never sovereignliness. At any moment in any night the call might come to take in a topsail, and a man who has to dress first is a man who arrives too late. So there is your bed, and there are your bedclothes, and they are the same thing. A grey kersey jacket with 15 brass buttons on it, worth 10 shillings and 6pence, going slightly stiff with salt, warm where the wool is damp, smelling of tar because everything does, a checkered shirt underneath, bare feet, a piece of old sail pulled up, the deck still holding a little of the day's heat. And it is nearly midnight, and there is a sound coming that will take half of these sleeping men and stand them back up on their feet. 8 bells, 2, 2, 2, 2, and then again, forward, from the main bell, half a beat behind. That is midnight, and it is the moment the ship turns over. Men who have been on their feet since 8 o'clock come down off the deck. Men who have been lying on the deck since 8 o'clock get up. It takes perhaps 3 minutes, and it is almost entirely silent, because everyone has done it several thousand times. There is one small detail here that I have grown fond of. A man going on watch at night did not take his hammock down. He did not lash it, he did not stow it, he did not tidy it away, he simply left it hanging. On a ship with a proper hammock deck, that means a whole row of them hanging empty in the dark for 4 hours, with nobody in them, waiting. On a sloop like ours, there is barely a hammock aboard to leave hanging, and the same thing happens with the flat patch of deck a man has been lying on. Now let me show you the piece of paper that this entire video is really about. It is called the watch bill. It is a list. It has every man's name on it, and against each name, which watch he stands. That is all. It is the most boring document imaginable, and it is the thing that makes a ship rather than a raft full of people. And in October of 1717, in a courtroom in Boston, a man called John Brown was asked about how a company like this treated the men it had taken by force, men who had not chosen to be there, men who had been carpenters and sailmakers on merchant ships, and had been kept because their skills were wanted. And this is his answer, and I would like to read it exactly. The names of the forced men were put in the watch bill, he said, and fared as others. They might have had what money they wanted from the quartermaster. Read it again, slowly. The names of the forced men were put in the watch bill. They wrote them into the list. A man who did not want to be there, who had been taken off another ship, was given a place in the rotation of who keeps the night, which meant he was fed like the others, paid like the others, and more than either of those things, he was one of the people the ship depended on between midnight and 4. Another man in the same trial, Simon van Vorst, put it in his own words. He said that he and the 6 who were with him were all equal as to the commanding part, being in course according to the list or watch bill, in course according to the list. That is a man in a court, on trial for his life, explaining his relationship to his shipmates, and the way he explains it is by naming a rota. Your place in the night was your proof of belonging. Now let me give you one of those forced men properly, because he is real, and he is one of the gentlest figures in this whole century. His name was Thomas Davis. He was 22. He came from Carmarthenshire, in West Wales, and he was a trained shipwright, a man who built and mended ships for a living. At his trial, he said he had used the sea these 5 years. He sailed out of Bristol in September of 1716 in a merchantman called the St. Michael, bound for Jamaica. In December she was taken. On the 9th of January 1717 he was moved across, and he was kept. Not for anything he had done, kept because he was a carpenter, and a carpenter is the man who stops a hull from filling with water, and no ship in the world can do without one. He asked to be let go. He asked more than once. And here is where you see exactly how these ships worked. The captain did not decide. The question was put to the company. Every man voted, and the company said no. He stayed. He said afterwards that he was no way active among the pirates, only as he was compelled by them. The court believed him. He was acquitted. The record says he fell to his knees and thanked the court, and then nothing. There is not another line about him anywhere. A 22-year-old shipwright from Carmarthenshire walks out of a Boston courtroom in the autumn of 1717 and out of history at the same moment, and I hope with all my heart he went home, now, sleep, because the men who have just lain down have 4 hours. 4 hours, if the night is kind. That is the whole of it, and then the bell will go again. Edward Barlow, who lived exactly this life for 40 years, wrote the best paragraph anybody ever wrote about it. He is comparing himself unfavourably to beggars. I was always thinking, he says, that beggars had a far better life of it and lived better than I did, because they seldom missed of their bellies full of better victuals than we could get, and also at night to lie quiet and out of danger in a good barn full of straw, nobody disturbing them, and might lie as long as they pleased. But it was quite contrary with us, for we seldom in a month got our belly full of victuals, and at night when we went to take our rest, we were not to lie still above 4 hours, and many times when it blew hard were not sure to lie 1 hour. Yea, often were called up before we had slept half an hour, and forced to go up into the maintop or foretop to take in our topsails, half awake and half asleep, with one shoe on and the other off, not having time to put it on. Half awake and half asleep, with one shoe on and the other off. He wrote that in his own hand, having taught himself to write for the purpose, some time in the 1660s, and it is still exactly what it is to be woken by someone else's emergency. But before you feel too sorry for him, I want to give you the other half of the picture, and it is a gentle one. 4 hours of sleep at a stretch did not sound to Edward Barlow the way it sounds to you, because ashore, in the same century, in the same England, ordinary people did not sleep the way we do either. They slept in 2 pieces. A first sleep, from not long after dark until around midnight. Then an hour or so awake in the dark in bed, in which people prayed and talked and thought and did the things people do at that hour. And then a second sleep until dawn. That was normal. That was simply what a night was for almost everybody, for almost all of recorded time, until artificial light took it away from us in the 1800s. So look at where the watches fall. The first watch, 8 in the evening to midnight, sits exactly over the first sleep. The middle watch, midnight to 4, sits exactly over the hour of waking and the beginning of the second. The men lying on this deck tonight are sleeping in the same shape as their mothers in Bristol and their wives in London. 4 hours, then up, then down again. It is not a strange life. It is the ordinary human night, cut into pieces by a bell instead of by the dark. And if you have ever woken at 3 in the morning and lain there and worried that something was wrong with you, I would like you to know that for most of human history that was simply the middle of the night, and people used it, and nobody thought anything of it at all. The candles are out, the watch is set, the ship is being kept, and while they lie there, somebody has to steer this thing through the dark. The man doing it cannot see out at all, and that is where we're going next. Let us go aft, and let us be quiet about it, because we're going to stand behind a man who is concentrating. The way this ship is steered is not the way you are picturing. There is a good chance there is no wheel. The ship's wheel is arriving in the world at almost exactly this moment. France officially adopted it in 1709 and Venice in 1719. So 1715 sits right in the middle of the changeover, and on a small merchant-built sloop the older gear is very likely still in place. The older gear is called a whipstaff, and it is wonderfully simple and slightly mad. The rudder is turned by a tiller, a long beam running forward from the rudder head, below deck. And attached to the end of that tiller, standing straight up through a hole in the deck above, is a vertical lever. That is the whipstaff. It works through an iron fitting called a gooseneck and pivots on a piece called a rowel. You push the top of it one way and down, and the tiller swings the other, and the ship comes round. It is not powerful. The tiller might get 20 degrees of movement out of it at the very most, and 5 to 10 is more realistic. But here is the thing about it that makes it a night chapter. The man on the whipstaff is below the deck. He is standing in a space under the quarterdeck, holding a stick that comes up through the floor above him, and he cannot see where the ship is going. He cannot see the sea. He cannot see the sails, except through a small opening in the deck over his head, called a companion, through which he can just make out the ship's head and a slice of sky. So he steers by two things: the compass in front of him, and a voice from above. Somebody up on deck who can see is telling him what to do, and he is doing it in a dark box by hand for hours. If there is a wheel instead, there is one detail I love. On a wheel, one of the spokes is different. It is called the king spoke, and its outer end is cut with extra grooves, so that a helmsman in total darkness, with no light on the wheel at all, can run his fingers along the handles until he finds the rough one, and know without seeing anything that the rudder is dead amidships. A groove cut in a piece of wood so that a man can find straight ahead by touch. Now, in front of him, the one light left in the ship. It sits in a wooden case called the binnacle. Before the 18th century the word was spelled biticle. Inside, the compass itself, floating, and beside it a light, so that the card can be read at night. That is it. That is the entire illumination of this vessel between 8 o'clock and dawn, one small shielded flame in a wooden box at the back of the ship, lighting a disc of painted card. I want to put that next to the article we heard earlier because this is the motif of the whole night, and here it is at its purest. Every candle in the ship was put out at 8 o'clock. Every one. 39 lashes if you carry a naked one below, except this one. Because a man has to be able to see which way he is pointing. Everything else can be dark. The men can sleep in the dark, eat in the dark, find their beds in the dark by counting. But the compass gets a light because the compass is where the ship is going. That is what a light is for in a well-run ship. Not comfort. Direction. Let me tell you about the card he's looking at. It is divided into 32 points. Not 360 degrees. 32 points, each of 11 1/4 degrees with names rather than numbers. North. North by east. North-northeast. Northeast by north. Northeast. And so on, all the way round. And each of those can be quartered, which gives 128 name positions on a single disc. A boy learned the whole thing by heart. All of it. In order, forwards and backwards, until he could rattle it off without thinking. That was one of the first things a ship's boy was made to do, and it was not a party trick. It was so that when a man behind him in the dark said a string of words, he could put the ship's head on it without hesitating. 128 names for directions, held in the head of a ship's boy, in a box, under a deck, at 1 o'clock in the morning. I will not give you the phrase people use for reciting them, because that phrase is a much later invention, and I would rather be accurate than tidy. How long did a man hold it? I would love to tell you, and I cannot. People will say an hour or 2 hours, and it sounds right. But I could not find anybody from this period who wrote it down, so I'm not going to invent a number for you at 1 in the morning. What is certain is that steering is tiring in a way that looks like nothing from the outside. It is unbroken small attention. You cannot let go for 10 seconds, and on a ship with 70 men aboard and only a handful needed to sail her, there is no shortage of somebody to take over. That is one of the quiet luxuries of a crowded deck. Whatever else was wrong with this life, a man at the helm here did not have to stand there until he could not feel his hands. So stand here a minute. The card turns very slowly under the lubber line, one way and then back. The little flame is steady inside its glass. The man's hands are on the whipstaff, easy, correcting almost before the ship has moved, the way a person carries a full cup down a corridor. Above him, through the companion, a rectangle of stars sliding gently left and then gently right. That rectangle is worth staying with. It is a small opening cut in the deck over his head, and it is his entire view of the world for the length of his trick. A patch of sky, a piece of the mainsail's edge, and whatever stars happen to be crossing it. When the ship rolls, the stars swing across the opening and come back. When she pitches, they rise up the frame and settle. He is not watching them for navigation. He is watching them because they are there, and because a person who is holding a stick in a dark box for a long time will look at whatever there is to look at, and behind him, the whole ship, asleep. I want you to notice what he is actually doing, because it is not really steering. He is deciding several times a minute that this ship is going to keep going the way she was going. That is all a course is. It is a very long series of small refusals to drift, and the reason 40 tons of wood and rope and sleeping men arrive somewhere in the morning, instead of lying beam onto the swell in the middle of the ocean, is that somebody in the dark kept making that decision quietly, without being watched, for 4 hours. Nobody would have known if he had not. That is the part that gets me. There is nobody checking. The pegs on the board would show it eventually at dawn when the sums came out wrong, but at 1:30 in the morning there is no supervision on Earth. He just does it properly because that is what you do. The candles are out. The watch is set. The ship is being kept. And every half hour while he holds that course, somebody quietly writes it down, in a way that was designed for men who could not read a single word. I want to show you my favourite object in the history of work, and it is a plank with holes in it. It is called a traverse board, and it solves a problem you may never have thought about. Here is the problem. A ship's course is not one thing. Over 4 hours the wind shifts and the helmsman meets it, and she comes up a point and falls off a point and comes back. By the end of a watch, nobody could possibly remember every small change, and yet the whole of navigation depends on knowing, on average, which way you went and how fast. So you need a running record, and you need one that can be kept by the man actually steering, in the dark, at sea, when he very possibly cannot write. The traverse board is that record. It is a wooden board in 2 parts. The top half has a compass rose painted on it, all 32 points, and radiating out from the centre are 8 concentric rings of small holes, a hole at every point on every ring, and hanging from the centre on strings, 8 little wooden pegs. Every half hour when the glass is turned and the bell is struck, somebody takes the next peg and puts it in the hole for the course the ship has actually been steering. Innermost ring for the first half hour, second ring for the second, and so on, working outward 8 times for the 4 hours of the watch. At the end of the watch, the pattern of pegs is read off, all 8 of them, and reduced to a single average course and a distance. That figure is written up. Then the pegs are pulled out and dropped back to the centre, and the next watch starts again from the middle. The lower half of the board does the same job for speed, with a row of holes for each hour and columns for the knots, and quarters, halves, and 3/4 in between. Now here is the sentence that makes me love it. In 1571, an Englishman named William Bourne wrote down that men who could not read or write could use the traverse board. That is the design brief. Somebody sat down and built a way of recording 4 hours of navigation that requires nothing but the ability to count to 8 and know your compass points by heart. An illiterate man in the dark keeping an exact record by feel with pegs. I think that is as fine a piece of design as anything in a museum. Now, the speed, because that comes from the other great object of the night, and it is the reason we all still say knots. It is called the chip log, or the log ship. The chip is a piece of wood cut as a quarter circle, a quadrant, 5 or 6 inches on the radius and about half an inch thick. Its curved lower edge is loaded with lead, so that when you throw it over the side it floats upright, standing in the water like a little rudder, and grips. Attached to it is a long line wound on a reel, and the line has knots tied in it at regular intervals. Many ships used 8 fathoms between knots, which is 48 feet. Here is the operation, and it takes about half a minute. The chip goes over the stern. It bites the water and stops dead, effectively anchored to the sea. The ship sails away from it, and the line runs out. At the same moment, a small sand glass is turned, and the knots are counted as they run out through a man's hand. When the sand is finished, so is the count, and the number of knots that went through a hand in 28 seconds is the ship's speed, and the arithmetic is exact. 8 fathoms in 28.8 seconds is precisely 1 nautical mile in an hour, which is why the glass they used ran to about 28 seconds. So when you hear that a ship is doing 6 knots, that is not a unit of speed. That is a description of an event, 6 actual knots tied in an actual rope, going through an actual hand while sand fell. They also carried a 14-second glass, a half glass, for when she was going fast enough that the whole line would have run out before the 28 seconds were up. You count in half the time and double it. So now our man knows 2 things. He knows the direction he's been going, 8 pegs in a board, and he knows how fast counted on a wet rope. Put those together with the time, which is the sand, and you can work out where you have got to. That is dead reckoning, and it is the whole of navigation in this century. It is also, if you think about it, an act of continuous faith. Every position on this ship's chart is a sum built on top of the last sum, built on top of the one before, back to the last known point of land. If one watch's pegboard was sloppy, or one man shook a glass to end his watch early, the error goes into the total and stays there and grows. They are navigating by adding up their own honesty. There is something else in the board that I keep turning over. It is a knight's diary, and it is written in holes. Every half hour from the moment the glass is turned, a peg goes in. And because the pegs work outward from the centre, you can look at the board at any moment and see, physically, how far through the watch you are. 2 pegs in, and it is 9 o'clock and there is a long way to go. 7 pegs in, and you are nearly done. A drowsy man could read the shape of his own night off a piece of wood, and then, at the end, somebody pulls all 8 of them out and drops them back to the middle, and 4 hours of a ship's life become 1 line of figures, and the board is blank again, ready. I do not know why I find that comforting, but I do. Let me lay the 2 things side by side because both are true and they sit oddly together. This is exact work. 8 fathoms, 28 seconds, 32 points, half hour by half hour, all night for weeks. And it is also, in the end, a guess. A very careful, disciplined, professional guess, built out of hundreds of small, honest observations, which is slowly and inevitably drifting away from the truth with every hour that passes. They knew that. Every one of them knew that, and they did it beautifully anyway. The candles are out, the watch is set, the ship is being kept, so he knows his course, and he knows his speed. What he does not know, and cannot possibly know, is where he actually is. And that is the strangest and quietest thing about a night at sea in this particular year. There is a rope on this ship with pieces of cloth tied into it, and the cloth is there so that a man can read the depth of the sea with his fingers. That is the lead line, and I think it is the most beautiful piece of equipment aboard. Here is how it works. At the end is the lead itself. A hand lead weighs 14 pounds. There is a bigger one for deep water, 28 pounds. It is shaped rather like a long weight on a grandfather clock, and it goes over the side ahead of the ship so that by the time she's come up to it the line is straight up and down. The line is 25 fathoms long. A fathom is 6 feet, the span of a man's outstretched arms, which is how you measured rope before anybody had a tape. And the line is marked, not with paint, not with numbers, with materials. At 2 fathoms, a piece of leather with 2 tails cut in it. At 3 fathoms, leather with 3 tails. At 5, a strip of white calico. At 7, a strip of red bunting. At 10, a piece of leather with holes punched at each end. At 13, blue serge. At 15, white calico again. At 17, red bunting again. At 20, a strand of light line with 2 knots in it. Every one of those is a different thing to touch. Leather is smooth and stiff. Calico is fine and cool. Bunting is loose and open. Serge is thick and slightly hairy. Knots are knots. A man hauling that line in pitch darkness, running it through his wet hands, knows exactly how deep the water is under this ship by feel alone, without a light, without looking, without stopping. The whole system was designed by somebody who understood that the times you most need to know the depth are the times you can see least. And there is a further refinement that I love. The unmarked stretches between the marks are called the deeps. So when a leadsman calls out, he calls one of 2 ways. If the water came to a mark, he calls by the mark 7. If it came to an unmarked stretch, he calls by the deep 6. By the mark. By the deep. Those 2 little phrases carry the entire distinction between what he can feel and what he has to judge. And the last touch, the one that makes it a piece of science, the base of the lead has a hollow in it, and you fill that hollow with tallow. Soft animal fat. When the lead strikes the bottom, whatever is down there sticks to the tallow and comes up with it. Mud, sand, shell, shingle. That is called arming the lead. And it means that a man in total darkness, in the middle of the night, can hold a piece of the sea floor in his hand and tell you where he is, because the chart says that off this headland the bottom is fine grey sand, and off that one it is broken shell. Reading the bottom of the sea at night with your fingers. I should say, since we have been careful all night, that the exact table of marks I read you is best documented later in the century than 1715. The principle, marks you can tell apart by touch and a lead armed with tallow, is very much older, and it is what these men were doing. Now, I want to tell you about the man on this kind of ship whose job that was, because he was 16 years old. His name was John Julian. He was a Mosquito man from the Central American coast, and he was the pilot of a ship in these waters in this very handful of years. The pilot is the man who reads the water, not the navigator, not the captain. The one who knows where the sand is, where the reef comes up, where you can go and where you absolutely cannot. On a coast, in the dark, the pilot is the most important person aboard, and everyone knows it. He was about 16. Of the whole company of his ship, he was one of only 2 men who reached the beach alive when she went ashore. What happened to him afterwards is a hard story, and it is not one for tonight, and I am going to leave it where it is. The thing I want you to keep is this. The man who knew the water best was about 16 years old, and he did not choose the course. Now let us go up on deck and look at the sky, because there is another kind of reading happening tonight. The pole star is up there, and it does what it has always done, which is stand nearly still while everything else turns. Nearly, not quite. And that is the part working seamen had to know. Polaris does not sit exactly on the pole. It goes round it in a small circle. In Columbus's time it was 3.5 degrees off. In 1545, 3 degrees. In our year, 1715, roughly 2. It is much closer today, but in this century it was still enough to matter, so you have to correct for it, and the correction depends on where the star is in its little circle at the moment you look. And how do you know that? You look at the guards. The guards are 2 bright stars at the lip of the Little Dipper. They swing round the pole like the hand of a great slow clock, and their position tells you where Polaris is in its own circle. Now, here is the beautiful part. To use them, seamen imagined a man in the sky, a figure standing there with his arms outstretched, head, feet, left arm, right arm, and when the guards were at his head you knew the North Star sat so far under the pole, when they were at his feet so far above, an imaginary man laid over the stars so that a sailor who could not read a table could correct his latitude by looking up and saying, "The guards are at his shoulder." The same instinct as the pegs in the board. The same instinct as the cloth on the lead line. Every piece of knowledge in this trade was translated by somebody into something that could be held or seen or felt by a man who had never been to school, so he can find his latitude. He can tell you how far north he is, and he can do it to within a few miles, at sea, at night, and he cannot tell you how far west he is. Not to within 100 miles, not to within any distance at all. There's no way of finding longitude at sea in 1715. None. Not for him, not for the finest navigator alive, not for anybody. They knew it was the great unsolved problem. Only the year before tonight, on the 8th of July, 1714, an Act of Parliament had received royal assent, offering public money for a solution. £10,000 for a method accurate to 1 degree. £15,000 for 40 minutes of arc. £20,000, which was an unimaginable fortune for half a degree. Isaac Newton and Edmund Halley themselves had advised Parliament on what the thresholds should be. That Act is barely a year old tonight. So think about where you're actually standing. You're on a small ship in the middle of an ocean. Every man aboard can tell you exactly how far he is from the North Pole. Not one of them, and no one in the world, can tell him how far he is from home. They are lying down to sleep in a place that cannot be located, and they do it anyway, every night, for their whole lives, because the pegs and the knots and the sand are enough, and because dawn will show them something, and because the alternative is not sleeping. The candles are out, the watch is set, the ship is being kept, and under all of it, all night, there is one sound that never entirely stops. It is the sound of the sea trying very slowly and very patiently to get in. Every wooden ship leaks, not the damaged ones, not the badly built ones. All of them, all the time, as a permanent condition of being made of separate pieces of wood. Here is why, and it comes back to what we saw down in the seams. A wooden hull is not rigid. It is a very large number of separate timbers, fastened together, and when she goes through a seaway she flexes. Every plank moves a little against every frame. The bow, taking the sea, pushes in and springs out again with each wave, and there is a word for just that motion. Panting. The ship pants. And that constant working is what loosens the caulking. The oakum that was driven into those seams by a man with a ringing mallet is being gently, endlessly persuaded back out again by the ocean, wave by wave, for the whole life of the ship. So a carpenter's most basic duty at sea is to find out how much water she has taken. He does it by sounding the well. The well is a vertical shaft beside the mainmast that runs down to the lowest part of the hull, and a rod is dropped down it and pulled up and read wet. Normally, on the figures we have, it shows a few inches. That is a healthy ship. That is a ship doing exactly what wooden ships do. After a hard blow, or if something has started, it might show feet, and it is checked every few hours, day and night, all voyage. Somebody is measuring the sea inside the ship at 2 a.m. while everyone sleeps. Now the pumps. Edward Barlow, who spent more of his life at a pump handle than any of us will spend at anything, has 2 lines about it, and they are worth hearing back to back. The pumps never stood half an hour still since she was laden, he wrote, and so we were forced to keep the pump going ever after. Never stood half an hour still, and elsewhere, forced to keep a pump going continually with 6 men at it. 6 men continually. Doing nothing but lifting water permanently for the rest of the voyage. Woodes Rogers gives us the numbers on a ship that was making water badly. The Marquis, one of the vessels in his company, sprang a leak one night in July of 1709 and made 8 inches of water in an hour. The carpenters stopped it. 8 inches in an hour. That is what a real leak looks like, and you can hear in the flatness of the entry that this was Tuesday. On another occasion, on his own ship, Rogers wrote that after many fruitless attempts they were forced to keep one pump continually going, every 2 men in the watch taking their posts once an hour, which labour, with the want of sufficient food, made their people look miserably. Every 2 men in the watch taking their posts once an hour. That is a rota inside a rota. The night watch is already a rotor, and inside it another one, pairs of men going to the pump in turn so that no two men have to do it twice. They organised even this. Even the worst job on the ship was shared out by a system, so that it fell on everyone equally and on nobody twice. Now the sound, because that is what matters to a man lying on the deck. A pump being worked is a slow, regular knocking, water and wood and iron, with a rhythm somewhere close to a heartbeat and about as interesting. It goes on and on. And then, at some point, it changes. The note goes hollow and rough, and it starts to gasp instead of pour. That is called sucking. It means the well is dry, and there is nothing left down there to lift. And that noise, that ugly rasping noise, is the best sound on the ship. It means stop. It means we have won this round. It means you can put the brake down and go and sit somewhere. I love that a ship's good news sounds like something breaking. There is one more thing about the pumps that I have carried around with me ever since I read it, and it is Barlow again. At some point in his long life at sea, his ship was in trouble and could not keep ahead of the water with her own people. And so, other ships sent men. He puts it in a few plain words. They were sent on board of us to help pump, he says, for we had had men out of every ship in company. Boats going across black water in the middle of the night, from vessels that were perfectly dry and perfectly safe, carrying men who had already done their own watch to go and work a pump handle for strangers. Nobody made them. There was no lifeboat service, no coast guard, no radio, no obligation of any kind that a court would have recognised. They just went, because that is what you do when a ship is filling. I think about that more than almost anything else in this period. The sea is the most indifferent thing there is, and the people who worked on it built, entirely among themselves without being asked, the habit of rowing towards somebody else's problem in the dark. I should tell you honestly that nobody can give you a figure for how many strokes an hour a hull of this age and size needed. It is simply not written down anywhere that survives, and I'm not going to invent one for you. What is certain is that she made water, that somebody sounded her every few hours, and that on many nights somebody pumped. So here is the picture I want to leave you with in this chapter, because I think it is the whole of the keeper's thread in one image. A man is lying on the deck asleep in his clothes with a piece of old sail over him. Below him and forward in the dark 2 men are working a pump, taking it in turns, an hour each, all night. And what they are doing, precisely and literally, is taking the sea back out of the ship, an armful at a time so that he can go on sleeping. He does not thank them. He does not wake up. He almost certainly does not hear it, because it has been going on his entire adult life, and the brain stops reporting things that never change. But if it stopped, he would wake instantly. That is the thing about the sounds of a working ship. Men slept through the noise and woke at the silence. The pump is not keeping him awake. The pump is what he is sleeping on. The candles are out. The watch is set. The ship is being kept, and there are men aboard tonight who will not be called for any of this. Men who will sleep the whole night through, from dark until light, without once being woken. It is worth knowing who they are and why, because the answer is kinder than you would expect. Not everybody on this ship is woken in the night. There is a group of men who sleep from dark until light, straight through, every night of the voyage, and the word for them is a period one, and it is not flattering. They are called the idlers. Here is a contemporary definition, and it is quite plain about it. Idlers were those members of a ship's crew, such as cooks and sailmakers, that did not stand night watch because of their work. Because of their work. That is the important half of the sentence. The idlers are the tradesman, the gunner, the armourer, the sailmaker, the carpenter, the boatswain, the cook we met in the bow. These are men whose work is done in daylight, with tools, in a good light, all day, and who therefore are not put into the 4 hours on and 4 hours off. So they sleep, all night, every night, and they were called idlers for it, by men who were being turned out at midnight, and I imagine that word was said with a certain flatness at times. But I want to point at something, because it is the reason I brought you here. The fact that some men slept all night is what makes the watch visible. If everybody was up, nobody would be keeping anything. It is only because there are men on this deck sleeping straight through until morning that the men walking about above them are doing something for somebody. The idlers are the proof, and this is a good place to say the quiet thing this whole night has been building towards. Nobody on this ship can make himself safe, not one of them. Not the captain, who can be voted out, not the carpenter, who can be kept against his will, not the boy at the glass, not the man at the whipstaff. Each of them, at some point in every 24 hours, has to lie down and stop and hand himself over. The only safety available anywhere on this vessel is the safety other people are holding for you. Now let me give you the warmest thing in the whole of my research, and it comes from a surgeon. His name was John Moyle, and he was an English sea surgeon, and in 1693 he published a working manual for men doing his job. He wrote it, he said, to save the lives and limbs of many. And in it, describing how a man with a fever is looked after at sea, he does not describe an infirmary, because there is not one. He does not describe nurses, because there are none. He writes about the sick man's messmates, who looked after them, his messmates, the 4 to 6 men he eats with every day, out of the same bag, out of the same kettle. That is who cares for you at sea in 1715. Not the ship, not an institution. The 4 men who share your food. One of them sits up with you, on a chest or on the deck beside you, in the dark, while the bell goes on marking the half hours, because you are hot and frightened and it is 3 in the morning and that is a bad hour to be ill in any century. Nobody is paying him. It is not in the articles. There is no rota for it. Barlow, who had been the sick man himself, is honest about how much and how little that could do. The sea, he wrote, is an uncomfortable and bad place for sick men, and many other miseries that poor seamen endure at sea when they are sick, having small means to comfort themselves with. For there they cannot run and fetch what meat and drink they think will do them good. They cannot run and fetch. That is the whole helplessness of it. Ashore, if you are ill, someone can go out and get you something. At sea there is nowhere to go and nothing to get, and what is in the barrel is what there is. He is sharper still about the doctors. Their common phrase, he says, is to come to a man and take him by the hand when they hear that he has been sick 2 or 3 days, thinking that is soon enough, and then feeling his pulses when he is half dead, asking him when he was at stool, and how he feels himself, and how he has slept, and how he has slept. Stop on those 4 words with me for a second, because I did. Even the careless surgeon, in Barlow's own bitter account of a bad doctor, asks the sick man how he has slept. 300 years ago, in the middle of the ocean, in a profession Barlow thought was largely useless, the question you asked a man who was ill was whether he had slept. We still ask it. It is the first thing anybody asks anybody. There is one last piece, and it is the company's promise, written down. In these articles we have been quoting all night. There is a clause about men who are broken in the ship's service. It says that if any man should lose a limb or become a cripple in their service, he was to have $800 out of the public stock, and for lesser hurts, proportionably. Another company under John Phillips set it at 400 pieces of 8 for a joint and 800 for a limb. And to understand what that meant, you have to know how the money was divided in the first place, because it is a very short list. 2 shares to the captain, 2 to the quartermaster, 1.5 to the master, the boatswain and the gunner, 1.25 to the other officers, and 1 share to every other man aboard. That is the entire pay structure. The man in command of the ship takes twice what the man who scrubs the deck takes. Twice, not 50 times, not 100 times, which is the sort of ratio a Royal Navy captain might enjoy over an able seaman. Now put the injury clause on top of that, and notice the order of operations, out of the public stock, That is the phrase to hold, the common fund, which means that when a prize was taken and the money was counted out, the man who had been broken was paid first off the top before anybody else took a share, by vote of the whole company, about a century and a half before any government anywhere provided such a thing. I am not going to make a speech about it. I will say only this, and then we will go up. Every single arrangement we have looked at tonight is about the same thing, and none of them were imposed from above. The odd number of watches, so the middle watch moves round, the forced man's name written into the list, the musician's Sunday, the pump rotor inside the watch rotor so nobody does it twice, the broken man paid before anybody else is paid. Nobody made them do any of that. There was no admiralty out here, no owner, no magistrate, nothing between these men and the ocean but each other. They worked it out themselves. They were no better than anybody else. But 70 men on 40 tons of wood find out very quickly what happens when nobody bothers. And so we will go up on deck, because out beyond the rail, the sea itself is doing something tonight that nobody aboard can explain. Before we go up to look at the water, I want to take you 300 years forward for a few minutes into a bright modern room, because there is something in it that belongs to tonight. On the 9th of November, 1716, a small sloop called the Bonetta was taken in these waters. Aboard her as passengers were a boy called John King and his mother, and the rest of it is documented because the Bonetta's master, a man named Captain Abijah Savage, swore to it afterwards. The boy wanted to go with them, not was taken, wanted to go. Savage's deposition says that from being forced or compelled to join, which is his own slightly awkward wording, he declared he would kill himself if he was restrained and even threatened his mother. He was about 9 or 10 years old. I've thought about that a great deal. Everybody has met a child like that. Everybody has been, at some point, a child like that, standing at the edge of something enormous and demanding to be allowed. He was aboard for less than 6 months. The ship went ashore on a coast far to the north in the spring, and he was lost with her, along with almost everybody else. Now, the modern room. That ship was found in 1984 on the Massachusetts coast by a man named Barry Clifford, who worked out roughly where she must be from a salvage map somebody had drawn in 1717. She was under about 14 feet of water and 5 feet of sand. In the autumn of 1985 they brought up her bronze bell, and her name was cast into it, and that settled it. More than 200,000 objects have come up since, and most of them come up looking like nothing at all, because of a process I find genuinely lovely. Iron in seawater corrodes. As it does, the metal and the dissolved salts bind together everything nearby, the sand, the clay, the small stones, and anything that happened to be lying against them, into one solid lump. They are called concretions. About 1,000 have been raised from that wreck, from the size of a fist to 13,000 pounds, and the average is about 100 pounds. So what comes up out of the sea is a rock, and inside the rock is somebody's life. They are kept submerged in fresh water so they cannot dry out. They are put through an X-ray so that the people working on them can see what is inside before they start, and then they are opened. The big ones with air scribes, which are miniature jackhammers, and the small and delicate ones with dental picks. Chris McCourt, who has worked on that wreck since 1996, explained why they have to move fast. Wood, leather and silk, he said, can begin to dry and deteriorate in a matter of hours if we do not begin the conservation process rapidly. Wood, leather and silk, because among the things that came out of that stone was a small black leather shoe, and inside the shoe a silk stocking, and inside the stocking a bone, the fibula, the outer bone of the lower leg, 11 inches long. In 2006 it was examined by researchers at the Smithsonian, and they concluded that it had not belonged to a small adult man, which is what everyone had assumed. It belonged to a child of roughly 8 to 11 years old, almost certainly the boy who told his mother he would rather die than be kept behind. I said almost certainly, and I mean it. It is an inference from the age and the size and that sworn deposition, and not a matched identity. but it is the best answer anybody has, and I do not think it is the wrong one. So here is the picture I wanted to bring you to. 300 years of the ocean, very slowly, wrapping a boy's shoe in stone, and then somebody in a workshop on Cape Cod in a bright room with a dental pick and a lot of patience, taking it off again, one small piece at a time, so gently that the silk survives. Nobody had to do that. There is no profit in a stocking. They did it because somebody was in there. Now let me widen it out, because that is not the only thing the sea has kept. There is another wreck of these years off the coast of North Carolina, found in 1996 in about 28 feet of water, and hundreds of thousands of things have come off her too. A bronze bell dated 1705, cannon, medical instruments, and of all things 16 paper fragments from a travel book, which survived 3 centuries at the bottom of the sea for the sole reason that somebody had stuffed them down a gun as wadding. Somebody's reading, saved by being thrown away. And along about 50 miles of the Florida coast, the 11 ships that went down in that hurricane just before our night are still there, and still coming apart and still giving things up. In 2015, 300 years to the day after the storm, gold coins came off one of the wrecks. In 2025, over 1,000 silver coins and 5 gold ones, many with the dates and mint marks still legible, in very fine condition. After a big storm, people walk that beach at first light. They have done for 60 years. Sometimes there is silver in the rack line, and there is one more thing they left and you have it in your mouth. When you say you are going to turn in for the night, that is theirs. Turn in, meaning go to bed, is attested from the 1690s, and it began at sea. You have been saying it your whole life. It came off a deck like this one. And here is the strange part. Of the actual world these men lived in, on land, almost nothing survives at all. The harbour they used in the Bahamas has a hotel on it. The old fort was pulled down in 1897, and there are fragments of its walls in the hotel grounds, and that is all. The huts, the tents, the beach where they hauled ships over to scrape them, the whole ramshackle town of it, gone completely. There is nothing above ground you can stand in front of. The man who was sent out to shut all of it down, a governor who arrived in 1718, took as his motto a Latin phrase meaning piracy expelled, commerce restored. That phrase remained the national motto of the Bahamas until 1973. So the thing that ended their world outlived it by 255 years, and their world left almost nothing at all, except a bell with a name on it, and a boy's shoe in a bright room, on a table, being uncovered. Nearly everything about their world was temporary, the huts, the sails, the rope, the men. What lasted was the care people took with small things, and a few words, and a shoe. The candles are out, the watch is set, the ship is being kept, and back on our own deck in 1715 the night has gone very quiet, and there is a light at the masthead that means something good. Come up to the rail with me, there is nothing to do here. There is only something to look at. The water going past the side is on fire, not warm, not red. Cold white light, breaking out wherever the sea is disturbed. It runs down the length of the hull in the bow wave. It boils up pale in the wake. If a fish turns down there, you see it turn, drawn in light. William Dampier saw it in a storm and wrote it down in 1697, and his sentence is better than any I could give you. It thundered and lightened prodigiously, he wrote, and the sea seemed all of a fire about us. For every sea that broke sparkled like lightning. Seamen called it the burning of the sea. Columbus had seen it too, 2 centuries earlier, and described it as being like the light of a wax candle moving up and down. And here is the thing I want you to hold, lying there in the warm dark. Nobody could explain it, not the men on this deck, and not the cleverest people alive either. Francis Bacon, in 1605, thought it was light struck out of droplets. Descartes, in 1637, thought seawater generated sparks rather as flint does. Robert Hooke, in 1665, thought it was some vibratory motion, and that the sea did not shine until it was beaten against something, Dampier himself, having looked at it more closely than any of them, decided it was probably some kind of jelly, and then wrote, rather wonderfully, but enough of this. Nobody worked out what was really doing it until 1762, nearly 50 years after tonight. So the men on this deck are looking at something magnificent, every night of their lives, which the finest minds of their century cannot account for, and they know that. They just watch it, the way you would. Now look up, because there is another light out here, and this one comes with a promise. It appears at the very top of the mast, at the head of the topmast, on the little cap at the very tip. A small point of light standing there, not flickering like a flame, steady and slightly moving. They called it a corposant. The word is Portuguese and Spanish, corpo santo, holy body. Dampier described one, and I want to read you the whole thing, slowly, because it is the finest piece of writing about a night at sea in the whole of this period. After 4 o'clock, he wrote, "The thunder and the rain abated, and then we saw a corpus sant at our main topmast head, on the very top of the truck of the spindle, and then this. This sight rejoiced our men exceedingly, for the height of the storm is commonly over when the corpus sant is seen aloft. A corpus sant," he goes on, "is a certain small glittering light. When it appears, as this did, on the very top of the main mast or at a yardarm, it is like a star. But when it appears on the deck, it resembles a great glow-worm, like a star at the masthead, like a glow-worm on the deck." An English writer aboard a ship called the Tiger had described the same thing back in 1605 and put its meaning even more plainly. "A flame," he said, "about the bigness of a great candle, which the Portugals call corpo sancto, holding it a most divine token that when it appeareth the worst is past. When it appeareth the worst is past. That is what it meant to them, not danger, the end of danger, a light that only comes when the worst of the weather has gone by. And that is our whole night, finished. Because remember what we did at 8 o'clock. We went round this ship and we put every light out, every candle, every lantern, all of it, down to one small flame in a wooden box so that one man could see which way he was pointing, and then the sky lit itself, and the water lit itself, and a small star came and stood on top of the mast to say the worst is past. Nobody struck any of those, and I will tell you what a man reached for on a night when the sea frightened him, because Edward Barlow wrote that down too. His ship nearly went down off Mauritius on the 27th of February, 1671, and afterwards, sitting somewhere with his ink, he reached for a psalm. He did not have a Bible in front of him. He had whatever was in his head from a church in Lancashire when he was a boy. Yet we may say with the psalmist, he wrote, in the 93rd Psalm and the 5th verse, "The waves of the sea are mighty and rage horribly. Yet the Lord who dwelleth on high is mightier, and delivered us out of all our fears and great danger." He got it slightly wrong. That is not quite how the verse goes, and it is not quite the right verse, and that is precisely why I love it. He is not quoting a book. He is quoting a memory of a book carried across half the world by a man who taught himself to write so that he could say things like this at all. The waves of the sea are mighty and rage horribly. And something is mightier. That was what he had, and it was enough. 2 more things, and then I will let you go under. There is a bird out here. Barlow writes about it, and he calls it a booby. It flies all day, and at some point in the night it gets tired, and it comes and lands on the yards, or anywhere else on the ship it can hold on to, and it stays there, until somebody comes along and takes it off with their hands. It is so tired it lets you pick it up. And there are flying fish. They come up out of the water in the dark, escaping something underneath, and because they cannot see at night they misjudge it and land on the deck. Men found them in the morning, so this ship, tonight, at 3 in the morning in the middle of nowhere, has visitors. A tired bird sitting on a yard, 2 or 3 fish lying on the planking, and 70 men asleep in the open air, under a sky that is doing all the work. The candles are out, the watch is set, the ship is being kept, and now the sky in the east is not quite black anymore, and there is one thing left to do before I let you go. It happens so slowly that nobody can say when it started. The sky low down in the east stops being black and becomes something else. Not blue, not grey yet. The colour of an old coin held up in a dim room. And the stars along that edge begin, one at a time, to go out. The sea is quiet. It very often is at this hour out here. The trade wind has eased the way it does before the sun, and the ship is going along easily with no fuss at all, and the long hiss along her side has softened. Look aft first. The binnacle lamp is still burning on the compass card. It has burned all night. And now, with the light coming up, it is starting to look faintly silly, the way a bedside lamp does at 6 in the morning when you have left it on. Nobody has put it out. In a few minutes somebody will. The man at the helm is still there. He has been holding a course he could not see for 4 hours. He knows his relief is coming, because he has been counting the pairs, and he has heard 7 bells and there is only 1 to go. Now look forward. Under the forecastle the cook has opened the iron door of the hearth. It is the first time it has been open in 18 hours. He is building a small fire in a brick box on a bed of brick in a wooden ship in the dark, the way somebody has done every morning of this ship's life. The first smoke of the day goes up, and the wind takes it and lays it flat over the water, and beside him in the steep tub the salt beef that has been quietly losing its salt all night is ready for a dinner nobody has thought about yet. Now look around the deck. They are all still asleep. A man with his back against the boat. A man in the shadow of the mainmast with a piece of old sail over him. 2 men close together, because 2 bodies are warmer than one. 1 hammock strung under the half-deck, swinging level while the whole vessel leans away and comes back and leans away again. Nobody's uncovered, nobody's cold. The night was warm, and the wind was kind, and the seams held, and out on the water the light has gone out of it. The burning of the sea only shows in the dark, and it is fading now, going ordinary, giving the ocean back its plain grey face for the day. At the masthead there is nothing. There does not need to be. The worst was never here tonight. The tar in the deck seams is cold and hard under your hand. In a few hours the sun will find it, and it will go soft again, and a thumbnail will leave a mark in it, and the whole day will start over. Somewhere below, the well has been sounded, and it showed a few inches, which is what it should show. 8 bells goes, 2, 2, 2, 2, and not one of them sits up. They know exactly what it means without opening their eyes, because they have been counting pairs in the dark since they were boys. So let me answer the question I left with you right at the beginning, before any of this. How do you fall asleep when there is nothing underneath you but the sea? The same way you do anywhere else. A light put out so that nothing can catch. A fire made safe by somebody whose job that is. A hand's width of wood made watertight by a man with a mallet who listened for the note, and somebody awake, all night, who is not you. That is all a safe night has ever been. It is the same in a cottage, and the same in an inn, and the same in your own house tonight. Safety was never a place. It was a rota. It was always a list of names, and somebody's turn. And here is the thing I would like you to take with you into sleep. They were not brave men doing an extraordinary thing. They were tired men doing an ordinary one. They wrote each other into a list. They gave the musician Sunday off. They paid the broken man first. They sat up with each other's fevers on a chest in the dark because there was nobody else to do it. Men with a chest worth 4 shillings and 11 pounds of wool to lie on, arranging with great care the conditions under which everybody else could rest. And you have been kept too tonight, in your own way. Somebody made the bed you're in. Somebody wired the room. Somebody, right now, at this hour, is awake somewhere so that a thing you rely on carries on working while you're not paying attention to it. It has always been like this. It was like this in a cottage with a banked fire, and in an inn with a bolted door, and out here with a hand's width of oak and a pump going in the dark. You have never once made yourself safe. Nobody ever has. That is not a failing. That is the arrangement, and it is a good one, and it has been holding for a very long time. You are on that deck now, in the last of the dark, and the light is coming up over the water, and the plank has held all night, and it is holding now, and it will hold. You do not have to do anything. Somebody has the watch. The fire is banked, the watch is stood down, and the sea is quiet, and the night will keep till morning. Sleep well, friend. If any part of tonight stayed with you, the candles going out, or the boy with the glass, or the shoe in the stone, I would love to read about it in the comments. A like and a subscribe help these long quiet nights find the people who are looking for them. And next time, I think we will find somewhere with a roof.